My father looked at me across the white linen tablecloth, pointed his soup spoon toward my sister, and said, "Pay attention, Nadia. This is what smart looks like." He spent 3 decades funding her Ivy League education, while I worked overnight shifts at a big box store, constantly reminding me I would never measure up. But 5 minutes later, his phone rang. It was the dean of her university, asking who actually wrote the algorithm that secured her doctorate. My father smiled, expecting my sister to laugh off the misunderstanding. Instead, her fork dropped to her plate. She started weeping and pointed a trembling finger at an old photo of me. I am Nadia, 33 years old, and I run a data security consultancy. Before I share how the truth unraveled a 30-year illusion, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome to Rabbit Revenge. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever sat in silence while toxic family members took credit for your hard work. The air inside the coastal Massachusetts seafood restaurant smelled of brine, melted butter, and polished wood. I sat at the edge of the booth, my phone resting face down on the table. I drove 40 minutes through heavy traffic just to sit here and be ignored. Across from me, my father Thomas held court over a bowl of New England clam chowder. He was hosting a dinner to celebrate my older sister Melissa. Her thesis defense in computational data models was scheduled for next week, and Thomas wanted the entire dining room to know it. He threw around the word genius. Every time he said it, a tight knot formed in the back of my throat. I kept my eyes focused on my water glass. A waiter rushed past our table, bumping a nearby serving tray. A wine glass tipped and shattered against the hardwood floor. Before the glass even hit the ground, my hand snapped out my fingers, clamping tight around the base of my own water goblet to steady it. It was pure muscle memory. I spent my whole life braced for things to break. Thomas wiped his mouth with a napkin and delivered the line that defined our family dynamic. "Pay attention, Nadia," he instructed, gesturing to Melissa. "This is what smart looks like." Then his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up, displaying an incoming call from a Cambridge area code. Thomas answered on speakerphone, projecting his booming, confident voice. "Dean Abbott," Thomas greeted. "We are just celebrating Melissa right now. To what do we owe the pleasure?" The voice on the other end of the line was careful and cold. "Mr. Evans, I need an urgent conversation regarding an academic integrity matter." Thomas chuckled, leaning back in his leather chair. "A minor paperwork issue, I assume. Just a formality." "This is not a formality," the dean replied. His tone stripped the warmth right out of the booth. "The Federal Review Board flagged a severe copyright discrepancy. I need to ask you plainly, who actually authored the predictive algorithm submitted in your daughter thesis?" The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull hum. Melissa froze. Her silver fork slipped from her fingers, clinking softly against her porcelain plate. All the blood rushed from her face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Thomas kept his half-smile, turning his head toward Melissa. He expected a swift denial. He waited for her to defend her academic crown. "Tell him," Thomas prompted, a hint of confusion creeping into his tone. Melissa did not speak. Her eyes dropped to the center of the table. She stared at Thomas' phone, where the lock screen still glowed faintly. The background image was an old family photo. Thomas and Melissa stood smiling in the foreground. Over their shoulders, out of focus in the background, was 17-year-old me wearing a blue Walmart employee vest. Melissa lifted a shaking hand. She pointed a single finger directly at the glowing screen. She pointed at me. She said nothing. She did not have to. I sat perfectly still. I did not feel the sudden rush of vindication I always thought this day would bring. I did not feel like a victor watching my enemies fall. A strange, suffocating vertigo gripped my chest. The floor tilted beneath my feet. I waited years for this exact moment, dreaming of the day they recognized my worth. Now that the moment arrived, it did not feel like winning. It felt like falling into a very dark hole. The rain began to fall against my windshield, the rhythmic tapping pulling me back to a rainy afternoon exactly 2 years prior. It was the day the fracture in my family shifted from passive neglect to active theft. I sat in my car, staring blankly at the wet asphalt, the memory playing out with agonizing clarity. I did not set a brilliant malicious trap for my sister. I was not a calculating mastermind playing a long game of revenge. I was genuinely deeply violated, and the trap that ultimately caught her was simply a byproduct of my own daily survival. 2 years ago, my data security consultancy was operating out of a cramped, poorly ventilated office space above a noisy auto body shop. I was working 90-hour weeks, constantly chasing small contracts just to keep the lights on and my engineers paid. One afternoon, my apartment buzzer rang. I opened the door to find Melissa standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of expensive artisan coffee. She looked disheveled. Her usually pristine clothes were wrinkled, and her eyes carried the heavy, frantic exhaustion of someone drowning in deep water. She claimed she was in the neighborhood and wanted to reconnect. It was the first time she had initiated contact in over 3 years without our parents acting as intermediaries. The isolation of my grueling work schedule had left me incredibly lonely. Despite a lifetime of cruel comparisons, a small, desperate part of me craved the warmth of my older sister. The lie. I carried inside my chest, whispered that maybe she finally respected me. I stepped aside and invited her in. Melissa sat on my worn sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her fingers around the coffee cup. She began talking about her Ivy League doctoral program. The facade of the effortless golden child cracked open. She confessed that the advanced computational models were breaking her. She admitted she lacked the coding fluency required to formulate a viable thesis. Her advisors were growing impatient, and the pressure from Thomas to secure her academic legacy was crushing her spirit. I listened, feeling a profound surge of empathy. I offered to cook us dinner, stepping into the small kitchenette to give her space to breathe. The scent of simmering garlic and onions filled the apartment. I turned my back on the living area, focusing on the stove, foolishly believing we were finally bridging the gap between us. I did not hear the quiet click of my laptop opening on the coffee table. I did not see her fingers flying across my keyboard. While I stirred pasta sauce, trying to formulate comforting words for the sister who once shielded me from our father, Melissa quietly inserted a flash drive into my machine. She copied a massive directory containing a prototype algorithm I had spent 8 months coding. I did not discover the theft until 3 weeks later. It was late on a Friday night, and I was running routine diagnostic checks on my server architecture. My company builds digital provenance software. We design the security protocols that allow major corporations to track the exact origin modification history and ownership of highly sensitive data files. Provenance watermarking is literally my product. Every single file I generate on my personal and professional devices automatically carries a deeply embedded encrypted authorship signature. It is not a booby trap designed to punish thieves. It functions exactly like the invisible metadata attached to a digital photograph silently recording the timestamp, the hardware MAC address, and my verified biometric login credentials. When my diagnostic software ran its sweep, a red alert flashed across my monitor. The system flagged an unauthorized file duplication event logged precisely on the afternoon Melissa visited my apartment. I pulled the specific access logs and traced the copied files. She had downloaded the entire core directory of my unreleased predictive routing algorithm. The sheer audacity of the act paralyzed me. The woman who sat on my couch crying about academic pressure had utilized my empathy as a smokescreen to rob me blind. My immediate instinct was to pick up the phone, call Thomas, and demand he hold his golden child accountable. I reached for my device, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. But before I could dial the number, the heavy, suffocating weight of my family dynamic crashed down over me. Confronting Melissa did not just mean arguing with my sister. It meant launching a direct assault against the entire Boston Brahmin illusion my parents had constructed. I pictured Thomas sitting in his leather armchair, listening to my accusation. I knew exactly how the conversation would unfold. He would not demand proof. He would scoff. He would aggressively defend Melissa, claiming I was fabricating a technical glitch out of bitter jealousy. He would accuse me of trying to sabotage her brilliant future because I was stuck running a tiny tech firm above a garage. My mother would inevitably join the chorus lecturing me about family loyalty and branding me a toxic, vindictive liar. The lie inside my chest, the deep-rooted belief that my worth required their validation, paralyzed my fingers. A dark, twisted logic took root in my mind. The algorithm she stole was flawless. It was a masterpiece of predictive data modeling. If she presented my code to the most elite academic minds in Cambridge, and they praised it as genius, they would actually be praising me. My family would unknowingly celebrate my intellect. My silence was not born of cold strategic calculation. I did not let her steal the code so I could orchestrate a public execution years later. I stayed quiet because confronting the machine required a strength I did not yet possess. I dressed my cowardice in the noble garments of patience. I told myself I was taking the high road by ignoring the theft. I convinced myself that securing my federal contracts and building my consultancy was a better use of my energy than fighting a losing battle against my father and his relentless gaslighting. But ignoring a parasite does not kill it. It only allows the parasite to grow unchecked. Sitting in my car outside the seafood restaurant 2 years later, the heavy rain obscuring the streetlights, the true cost of my silence finally materialized. By choosing to do nothing, I had completely surrendered control of my own creation. I had allowed Melissa to carry my proprietary software into the shadowy halls of academia without any oversight. I gripped the steering wheel, a sickening wave of nausea washing over my stomach. The dean had not called Thomas to discuss a minor citation error. He had specifically cited a catastrophic copyright flag triggered by a federal review board. A federal review board does not care about university politics or a father protecting his golden child. Federal boards only get involved when significant government resources or defense sector interests are at stake. My mind raced through the implications. I had no idea how far Melissa had taken my stolen work. I did not know what grants she had applied, for what institutional partnerships she had forged, or who else was currently standing on the fragile foundation of my code. My desperate need for indirect validation had allowed my intellectual property to spiral completely out of my control. I realized with terrifying clarity that the sting I was about to walk into was not solely my family attacking me. It was a disaster partially fueled by my own passive complicity. The very wound that caused my paralysis had actively manufactured the danger closing in around me. My phone vibrated violently in the cup holder, shattering the quiet hum of the rain. The screen illuminated, cutting through the dark interior of the car. The caller ID displayed the name I had dreaded seeing for the past 20 minutes. Thomas. The fallout was no longer contained to a restaurant booth. The golden child was exposed, and the patriarch was preparing his counterattack. I stared at the flashing screen, knowing I could no longer hide behind my silence. The harsh vibration of my phone buzzed against the center console, cutting through the damp chill of the car interior. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I did not answer. I watched the screen glow in the dark cabin of my sedan, letting it ring until it went to voicemail. The rhythmic drumming of the coastal rain against the windshield mirrored the rapid beating of my heart. I was not a calculating strategist who had meticulously orchestrated my sister's downfall from the shadows. The truth was far more pathetic and painful. I was a victim of my own desperate need for validation, and the snare that had just closed around my family was a hazard I had allowed to grow through my own inaction. It happened 24 months ago. At the time, my data security consultancy was nothing more than a fragile ambition housed in a drafty, exposed brick loft on the fringes of South Boston. I worked 90-hour weeks, surviving on black coffee and sheer stubbornness, trying to secure enough regional contracts to keep my servers running and my small team paid. One crisp October evening, the heavy iron buzzer of my loft sounded. I unlatched the deadbolt to find Melissa standing in the gloomy hallway. It was the first time she had initiated contact or visited my home in over 4 years. She looked entirely out of place. Her pristine camel coat was rumpled, and dark circles shadowed her usually flawless eyes. She carried 2 artisan lattes, offering a tight, fragile smile. She stepped inside and confessed she was drowning. Her doctoral program in Cambridge was tearing her apart. The complex mathematical models required for her thesis were beyond her coding fluency, and the relentless pressure from our father to maintain her academic pedestal was suffocating her spirit. For the first time in my life, she did not look at me with practiced condescension. She looked at me with genuine, exhausted vulnerability. I was starved for that connection. The unyielding comparison that defined our childhood had isolated me, leaving a hollow ache that professional milestones could never fully heal. Seeing my older sister standing in my doorway asking for a safe harbor felt like a quiet truce. I invited her deeper into the apartment. We sat on my thrifted sofa drinking the coffee. I listened to her vent about her advisors and her impossible deadlines. I felt a profound, dangerous empathy. I told her I would cook us dinner, hoping to prolong the rare warmth filling the room. My loft featured an open-concept layout. I stepped into the small kitchenette to prepare a simple pasta dish, turning my back to the living area. The rhythmic sound of boiling water and the sizzle of garlic in a hot pan masked the subtle, quiet, metallic slide of a USB drive seating into a port. I had left my primary workstation open on the coffee table. I trusted her. While I stirred the sauce, believing we were finally bridging the chasm between us, Melissa copied the core directory of a prototype predictive algorithm I had spent 7 grueling months building. She packaged my labor, slipped the drive into her designer coat, and thanked me for the dinner. I did not uncover the violation until 3 weeks later. It happened during a routine diagnostic sweep of my company network. My firm specializes in provenance watermarking. It is the foundational product I sell to corporate clients seeking to protect their intellectual property from theft and unauthorized distribution. Provenance watermarking is not a retaliatory booby trap. It operates exactly like the invisible metadata woven into a digital photograph by a camera lens. Every line of code I generate, every algorithm I compile, automatically embeds a cryptographic signature deep within its architecture. This signature permanently records my keystrokes, the specific hardware identification of my machine, and a verified immutable timestamp of creation. It is digital DNA. When I ran my monthly security audit, a red flag appeared on my secondary monitor. The system recorded an unauthorized duplication event localized to the exact date and hour Melissa had visited my loft. I pulled the access logs and traced the encrypted pathway. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical strike to the ribs. She had harvested my prototype. The golden child, crumbling under the weight of her own manufactured brilliance, had used a rare moment of sisterly vulnerability as a smokescreen to rob me blind. My first instinct was furious action. I reached for my phone, ready to dial my father and demand a reckoning. I wanted to drag the stolen data into the light and force my family to acknowledge what she had done, but my hand hovered over the screen, paralyzed by the familiar crushing gravity of our family dynamic. Confronting Melissa meant declaring war on the entire illusion my father had constructed. Thomas would never believe me. He would twist the narrative, accusing me of hacking her files out of petty jealousy. He would frame my evidence as a desperate ploy to sabotage her Ivy League success. Beneath the fear of his rage, a much darker, insidious thought took root. The lie I had internalized since childhood whispered from the shadows of my mind. The algorithm she stole was a brilliant piece of software architecture. If Melissa submitted my code to the most elite academic minds in New England, and those professors lauded it as a breakthrough, they would actually be praising my intellect. For 30 years, my father told me I would never measure up. Now, my raw, uncredited intellect was propping up his greatest achievement. I convinced myself that my silence was a form of strategic patience. I dressed my cowardice in the armor of superiority. I told myself I did not need their validation while secretly feeding on the twisted satisfaction that my brain had built her crown. I did nothing. I let the theft slide into the shadows, focusing instead on securing my first major corporate clients. I locked the access logs away, refusing to confront the rotting foundation of our relationship. The rain continued to batter my sedan, washing away the distorted reflection of the streetlights. The silence in the car was deafening. My phone stopped buzzing, leaving a dark blank screen in the cup holder. The true devastating cost of my inaction finally materialized, wrapping around my throat like a vice. By choosing not to expose her theft 2 years ago, I had surrendered all control over my own creation. I had let a proprietary, highly sophisticated algorithm wander blindly into the academic and corporate wild. I had no idea how far Melissa had taken my work. A doctoral thesis was merely a stepping stone. If her university advisors believed the code was her original creation, they would have encouraged her to leverage it. Who else had reviewed it? What institutional partnerships had she forged using my intellectual property? Had she presented it to private investors or secured federal grants based on its predictive capabilities? The dean had not called my father over a simple citation error or a minor case of plagiarism. He specifically cited an academic integrity issue escalated by a federal review board. Federal boards do not intervene in basic university disputes. They intervene when significant government funding or defense sector interests are compromised. My desperate unspoken need to feel superior had allowed my software to become deeply embedded in an unknown high-stakes ecosystem. I stared at the dark dashboard, a sickening dread pooling in my stomach. The confrontation I was about to face was not just my father protecting his favorite daughter. It was a crisis, amplified and accelerated by my own passive complicity. My refusal to fight back had created a monster I could no longer measure or contain. I rolled down my window, letting the freezing coastal wind hit my face. The damage was done, and the inevitable fallout was waiting for me. I put the car in gear, realizing the snare I was caught in was one I had helped build. My phone chimed with a terse text message from Thomas before I even started my car engine. He demanded my presence at the family estate in the wealthy suburbs immediately. I pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, bracing for a chaotic shouting match. I expected shattered plates, frantic accusations, and hysterical tears. When I walked through the heavy front doors of his sprawling coastal home, the silence was unnerving. The house felt like a fortress preparing for a siege. I found them waiting in his mahogany-paneled study. Thomas stood by the stone fireplace, pouring a glass of scotch from a crystal decanter. He was not frantic. He wore the precise, calculated demeanor he reserved for hostile corporate negotiations. Melissa sat perfectly straight on a tufted leather sofa. Her earlier panic at the restaurant was gone, replaced by a cold, rehearsed composure. The tears were dried. They had used the time it took me to drive here to build an impenetrable defense strategy. Thomas took a slow sip of his drink and outlined the reality they had constructed. He spoke in a measured, even tone, treating me not as a daughter, but as a minor liability that needed to be managed. He told me they had already consulted with University Counsel and a private intellectual property lawyer. Their narrative was airtight and legally insulated. According to the official timeline they planned to present, I did not write the algorithm independently. I was acting as an unpaid research assistant. The code was classified as a work for hire, produced under the direct supervision and intellectual guidance of my sister. He walked over to his heavy oak desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished wood toward me. I stepped forward and looked down. It was a formal intellectual property acknowledgement transferring all rights source code and underlying architecture to Melissa. The date stamped at the top was from 2 years ago, right around the time she visited my cramped apartment. At the bottom of the page rested my signature. I stared at the blue ink. It was a very good imitation mimicking the sharp slant of my initials, but it was a forgery. I recognized the subtle, unnatural hesitation in the loop of the letter N. My father had fabricated a legal contract to steal my creation. I kept my face perfectly blank. I did not gasp or call him a liar. My daily life involves hunting security breaches and anticipating threats. Revealing my hand now would only give them a chance to pivot and destroy the evidence. I needed to see the full shape of the trap before I made a move. Thomas tapped the surface of the desk. He explained that the university required a fresh notarized confirmation today to clear the federal copyright flag and satisfy the dean. He offered me a choice. If I signed the new confirmation document right now, he promised to carve out a place for me in the local tech industry. He would throw some low-level consulting work my way to ensure I stayed afloat. But if I refused, he laid out the alternative with chilling, unmistakable clarity. Thomas was a fixture in the Boston business community. He sat on the advisory board of a regional commercial bank. He shared a country club locker room with the exact venture capitalists and angel investors I needed to stabilize my fragile firm. He looked me dead in the eye and listed the levers he could easily pull. He promised to make a few quiet phone calls to his friends in the financial sector. He casually mentioned a business columnist he played golf with someone who could publish a devastating article labeling my startup a security risk and an operational liability. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My data security firm was surviving month to month on a razor-thin margin. I had 12 brilliant employees relying on me to make payroll every 2 weeks. I was currently pouring every ounce of my energy into reaching for a lucrative federal contract that would finally bring me true financial independence. I was not rich yet. I was vulnerable. Thomas was not bluffing. He possessed the influence to choke off my capital, sever my pending contracts, and strangle my business in its crib. He could end my professional life before it truly began. I looked away from my father and turned to the woman sitting on the sofa. Melissa stared at the wall, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence between us stretched heavy and suffocating. "Why mine?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the large room. You had the entire Ivy League at your disposal. You had access to brilliant academic advisors and endless institutional funding. You could have asked me to tutor you. You could have asked for my help. Why steal it? Melissa finally turned her head. The defensive posture cracked for just a fraction of a second, revealing the hollow, exhausted core underneath her polished exterior. "You do not ask the person you were told your whole life to beat," she said quietly. That single sentence laid bare the tragic reality of our household. The relentless comparison our father enforced had poisoned us both. It turned my sister into a fraud who believed her only value lay in an academic title, and it turned me into an isolated island, constantly trying to prove my worth to a judge who rigged the game from the start. We were two sides of the same broken coin, manipulated by a man who demanded perfection at any cost. Thomas held out a silver pen, interrupting the brief moment of shared understanding. "Sign the confirmation, Nadia. Let us put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us and protect the family name. Be smart for once in your life." I looked at the silver pen resting in his outstretched hand. The trap was excruciating. If I fought them, I risked the total destruction of the company I built from nothing. I would lose my livelihood and fail the employees who trusted me. If I folded and signed the paper, I would surrender my own creation, validating the lifelong lie that my intellect was only valuable when it served their needs. Both roads led to ruin. Both choices confirmed the toxic narrative that I was inferior. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Before Thomas could register my movement, I snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph of the forged document resting on his desk. The camera shutter sound echoed sharply in the quiet study. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, maintaining steady eye contact. "I am not signing anything tonight," I told him, stepping away from the desk. Thomas narrowed his eyes, the polite patriarchal facade slipping to reveal the ruthless predator underneath. "You are making a fatal mistake," he warned, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "You will lose everything you have built." I turned and walked out of the study without looking back, leaving them in the silent house. I drove back to my apartment with the radio off, the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers, the only sound in the dark cabin. The coastal rain blurred the streetlights as I navigated the winding roads back toward the city. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind spinning through the encounter. The threat against my business was terrifyingly real. My father had the power and the cruelty to follow through on his promise to ruin me. But beneath the fear of bankruptcy, a cold, analytical question began to form in my mind. Thomas was a ruthless businessman, but he was also famously risk-averse. He guarded his reputation with paranoid intensity. Forging a signature on an intellectual property document was a felony. It carried severe, inescapable legal consequences if discovered. Why would a man obsessed with his pristine social standing risk a federal forgery charge just to save his daughter from an academic embarrassment? A revoked diploma was a scandal, but a forged legal document was a prison sentence. The math did not add up. The penalty far outweighed the crime. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, the engine idling in the rain. Thomas was terrified of something much larger than a university disciplinary hearing. He did not forge that document to protect Melissa. He forged it to protect himself. I was staring at the surface of a deep, dark well, and I had no idea what kind of monster was hiding at the bottom. The harsh glow of my dual monitors was the only light in my apartment when dawn finally broke over the Boston harbor. I had spent the entire night tearing through commercial databases, driven by the cold certainty that my father was hiding a catastrophic vulnerability. A businessman like Thomas, obsessed with maintaining his flawless country club facade, does not commit a felony forgery simply to protect an Ivy League degree. A forged signature is a desperate, messy maneuver. It is the action of a man trying to stop a hemorrhage, not a man dealing with a minor academic headache. I needed to understand what he was so terrified of losing. My first instinct was to attack the fraudulent intellectual property transfer he had presented in his study. I sent the high-resolution photograph of the forged document to a trusted friend who worked as a senior paralegal at a prominent downtown law firm. I expected her to outline a swift legal strategy to invalidate the signature. Instead, her response arrived an hour later, carrying a heavy dose of grim reality. She warned me that walking into a civil court with just a photograph of a forged signature would be a disaster. Thomas possessed deep pockets and an army of corporate attorneys. He had already established his narrative with the university, officially framing me as an unpaid research assistant. In the legal arena, my friend explained the first story to take root often wins the initial battle. If I filed a suit, Thomas would bury me in discovery requests and preliminary injunctions. He would weaponize his wealth to bleed my fragile company dry in legal fees before a judge ever reviewed the authenticity of the ink. The forgery was a weapon I could not yet deploy without triggering my own financial ruin. The walls of my small apartment suddenly felt incredibly tight. I was holding a piece of the puzzle, but the legal system actively blocked me from using it. Denied a direct assault on the document, I pivoted my focus entirely to my father and his primary source of power. Thomas ran a regional commercial supply company that provided industrial materials to construction firms across New England. It was the engine that funded their sprawling coastal estate and Melissa's exorbitant tuition. I utilized my data architecture skills to scrape every piece of public financial data I could legally access regarding his business. The initial results revealed a concerning level of superficial decay. The company had missed filing deadlines for its annual corporate reports over the last 2 quarters. I found a quiet secondary lien placed against one of their suburban warehouses by a mid-tier logistics vendor. The business was clearly struggling with cash flow, but late filings and minor liens are common in the supply sector during economic downturns. They indicated stress, but they did not equate to a fatal apocalyptic collapse. More importantly, I hit a hard digital wall. As a private entity, his internal corporate ledgers, his tax returns, and his primary loan agreements were completely sealed. Without a court order or internal access credentials, I had no legal mechanism to penetrate the dark financial heart of his operation. I was stuck staring at the symptoms without any way to diagnose the disease. I had deep, gnawing suspicion, but absolutely zero actionable proof. The suffocating frustration of hitting that dead end was shattered by a sharp, urgent ring from my office phone just before noon. The caller ID displayed the main number for Sentinel Logistics, a rapidly expanding regional transport company. For the past 6 months, I had been engaged in delicate high-stakes negotiations with their executive board to secure a massive data security contract. Winning the Sentinel account was the lifeline my consultancy desperately needed. It was the contract that would finally elevate my firm from a fragile startup to a stable, profitable enterprise. I answered the call expecting to finalize the integration timeline. Instead, the voice of their chief operations officer came through the receiver, stiff and uncharacteristically formal. He did not offer small talk. He informed me that the board of directors had suddenly decided to place our contract negotiations on an indefinite pause. He cited unexpected internal restructuring and a need to reevaluate their security vendor profiles. I asked for clarification, maintaining a steady professional tone while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The executive hesitated, lowering his voice slightly. He mentioned that a highly respected member of the local business community had contacted their board chairman late last night, expressing severe concerns about my firm's operational stability and long-term viability. The call ended with a hollow promise to circle back next quarter. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle, my hands trembling slightly. The timing was not a coincidence. The attack was immediate, precise, and breathtakingly cruel. Thomas had made good on his threat in less than 12 hours. He had weaponized his Boston network, casually picking up a phone to dismantle my livelihood while I was still trying to uncover his secrets. The stakes of this conflict violently escalated. This was no longer a theoretical debate about intellectual property or sibling rivalry. Thomas was actively choking off my capital. If he successfully severed 2 more contracts, I would not be able to make payroll next month. I would lose the company I had spent my youth building. The situation demanded immediate, aggressive escalation. I needed heavy artillery, and I knew exactly who possessed the necessary legal firepower. Her name was Priya. We had met 5 years ago when I was a junior analyst working long hours at a mid-level tech firm. Priya was a brilliant, fiercely determined corporate attorney navigating the treacherous waters of federal compliance law. She was facing a disastrous internal audit engineered by a corrupt senior partner attempting to make her the scapegoat for a missing defense contract file. I stayed late for 3 nights quietly tracing the deleted server logs to locate the missing file and exposing the partner's sabotage, saving her career in the process. She moved on to become a highly sought-after federal contracts compliance attorney in Washington, but she always remembered the quiet tech analyst who stood by her in the dark. She was the perfect ally. She understood the labyrinth of federal regulations, and she owed me a debt. But as I opened my contacts list and stared at her name on my phone screen, my thumb hovered over the call button. The lie that had defined my entire existence flared up, wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. I had spent my entire adult life proving that I did not need my family, that I did not need anyone. I built my company in isolation. I taught myself to code in a freezing stockroom. Asking for help felt like a betrayal of the independence that had kept me alive. My pride whispered that relying on an outside force validated the narrative that I was not smart enough to handle the crisis on my own. I locked my phone and shoved it into my desk drawer. I would find another way. I had to win alone. I spent the remainder of the afternoon pacing my office, trying to map out a defense strategy against an opponent who held all the economic leverage. The crushing weight of the paused Sentinel contract settled over me. My father had turned my professional survival into a ticking clock. The original wound, the lifelong need to prove I was intellectually equal to the golden child, felt entirely irrelevant now. This was not about securing an apology or forcing them to admit my genius. Thomas had fundamentally altered the battlefield. He had made this a fight for basic survival. I looked at the whiteboard covering the wall of my office, staring at the scattered notes detailing his late filings and the quiet lien. A new, terrifying dread began to surface, chilling the blood in my veins. Thomas was a man who protected his assets with paranoid intensity. He would never casually risk his pristine reputation by forging a legal document just to shield Melissa from academic disgrace. He would only take a risk that massive if he was staring down the barrel of total catastrophic ruin. The stolen algorithm had to be structurally load-bearing for something within his own empire. If my proprietary code was the only thing preventing the collapse of his commercial supply business, then the secret he was desperately trying to hide was significantly larger and much closer to home than a simple university diploma. The monster at the bottom of the well was moving, and I was running out of time to find a weapon. The silence in my office stretched late into the evening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the nearby interstate. The reality of my isolation pressed heavily against my shoulders. My father had successfully severed my largest pending contract, proving he possessed both the means and the willingness to starve my business to death. The pride that had fueled my solitary climb from the stockroom floor was now a luxurious liability I could no longer afford. Surviving a siege requires reinforcements. I opened the desk drawer, retrieved my phone, and dialed the number I had stared at for hours. Priya answered on the third ring. Her voice was sharp and alert, carrying the rapid cadence of a woman accustomed to operating in high-stakes environments. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. I laid out the stark mechanics of the crisis, detailing the stolen algorithm, the forged intellectual property transfer, and the sudden aggressive financial strangulation Thomas had initiated against my firm. I asked her directly to bypass the standard legal channels and pull the sealed financial records of my father's commercial supply company. A heavy, deliberate pause met my request. When Priya spoke, her tone shifted from a supportive former colleague to a cautious federal compliance attorney. She flatly refused to execute an illegal breach of sealed corporate ledgers. She explained that risking her legal license and her position in Washington to hack a regional business was a line she would not cross regardless of the debt she owed me. The refusal hit me like a physical barrier, adding another frustrating block to my desperate investigation. My request for a shortcut had failed. However, Priya did not abandon me. She offered a different, entirely legal strategy. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of federal reporting requirements and commercial lending protocols. She taught me how to weaponize the public domain, directing my attention away from the sealed private ledgers and toward the mandatory disclosures required by institutional lenders and government oversight committees. Over the next 6 hours, communicating through a secure encrypted channel, we systematically pulled apart the financial facade of my father's empire using only publicly available data fragments. We started with the Uniform Commercial Code filings registered with the state of Massachusetts. These documents publicly record security interests placed on corporate assets by lending institutions. Priya instructed me to cross-reference the filings associated with Thomas's supply company against recent shifts in regional commercial banking portfolios. The resulting data illuminated a staggering reality. Thomas's company was not merely struggling with a temporary cash flow issue. The business was entirely insolvent. The operational revenue had flatlined over a year ago. He was keeping the lights on and financing the exorbitant upkeep of the Cape Cod estate exclusively through a massive, highly precarious $3 million commercial loan recently issued by a prominent Boston bank. The sheer size of the loan contradicted the dismal performance metrics of his supply company. Banks do not issue multi-million-dollar lifelines to failing regional distributors without substantial rock-solid collateral. I dug deeper into the specific loan origination documents Priya helped me isolate. I located the asset declaration Thomas submitted to secure the funding. My blood ran completely cold as my eyes scanned the listed collateral. Thomas had not leveraged his residential properties or the company's depreciating fleet of delivery trucks. He had formally listed a proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm claiming exclusive corporate ownership of the code. He attached a heavily inflated financial projection guaranteeing massive future licensing revenue derived directly from the software. My father had actively used my stolen unreleased work as the primary collateral to secure a $3 million loan. He had committed severe, undeniable federal bank fraud. The frantic aggression in his study, the forged signature, the desperate threats to destroy my business. Every piece of his manic behavior suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. If Melissa was expelled and the university formally flagged the algorithm as stolen property, the collateral securing the loan would instantly evaporate. The Boston bank would immediately call in the debt, triggering a catastrophic default. Thomas would lose his business, his properties, and his freedom. He was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison, and I was the only person standing between him and total annihilation. But the fraud ran deeper than a desperate father falsifying a loan application. The bank's underwriters would never have approved a $3 million loan based solely on the hypothetical projections of a regional supply company executive. They required external institutional validation to verify the algorithm's exorbitant worth. Priya guided me into the federal grant databases, searching for any connection between Melissa's academic lab and government funding. The search query returned a massive, undeniable hit. Melissa's university research department had recently secured a highly lucrative advanced research grant directly funded by a federal defense program. The primary documentation used to justify the grant application was the exact predictive algorithm she had stolen from my apartment. The university had essentially rubber-stamped the software's validity, providing Thomas with the institutional credibility he desperately needed to deceive the commercial bank. We pulled the publicly available grant approval documents. At the bottom of the final page securing the federal funding rested 2 signatures. The first belonged to the head of the research department. The second signature belonged to a senior university administrative official. I stared at the name, committing the cursive script to memory, though I did not yet grasp the lethal significance of his involvement. The family's panicked, unified front was not solely about protecting Thomas from bank fraud. Someone high up within the university hierarchy had signed off on a fraudulent federal grant, knowing the valuation was heavily inflated. They were desperately trying to contain a scandal that could trigger a massive federal audit of the entire academic institution. Sitting in the dim light of my office, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of my family's spectacular criminality, I expected to feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I had finally uncovered the rot beneath the polished Boston Brahmin exterior. I possessed the power to destroy the man who had spent 3 decades telling me I was worthless. I braced myself for the intoxicating rush of victory. Instead, a heavy, suffocating wave of profound pity washed over me, dragging a deep old grief in its wake. The feeling sickened me. I despised the sudden lump forming in my throat. I looked at the fraudulent loan documents, seeing the desperate, pathetic maneuvers of a man terrified of losing his country club status. I closed my eyes, and the image of a much younger version of myself flashed in my mind. I saw a little girl standing in a sprawling suburban kitchen, holding a perfect math test, waiting desperately for her father to look away from his newspaper and offer a single word of genuine pride. The rot I had just exposed in his corporate ledgers was the exact same rot that had infected my entire childhood. He had traded his integrity and his daughters for an illusion. Priya's sharp voice broke through the silence of the encrypted call, snapping me back to the dangerous present. She did not offer comfort. She offered a stark, terrifying legal reality check. She explained that uncovering the fraud did not make me safe. It made me incredibly vulnerable. Because my proprietary intellectual property was now deeply embedded in a fraudulent federal grant and a multi-million-dollar bank scam, the blast radius of the crime had expanded exponentially. If I went public with the theft in the wrong way, or if I simply walked into a police station with the evidence aggressive, federal investigators would not automatically view me as an innocent victim. They would see a data security expert whose software was conveniently utilized to secure millions of dollars for her immediate family. They could easily paint me as a silent co-conspirator, accusing me of building the algorithm specifically for the fraud, and only claiming theft when the scheme began to unravel. The trap my father built possessed sharp, lethal teeth designed for me as well. Exposing them meant risking my own freedom. The path to survival required a flawless, heavily armored execution. The gravity of Priya's warning hung over my office like a suffocating shroud. If the federal authorities suspected I was complicit in the $3 million collateral fraud and the falsified defense grant, my business, my reputation, and my freedom would be instantly vaporized. I could not simply run to the police with a folder of screenshots. I needed to execute a countermaneuver so precise that it would trap Thomas and Melissa in their own lies, while simultaneously establishing my absolute undeniable innocence on the federal record. The only way to achieve that level of public exoneration was to let them confidently walk themselves into an institutional slaughterhouse. I needed to construct a decoy. The engine driving this entire phase of my plan relied entirely on calculated misdirection. I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to my father. I did not write a defiant manifesto or demand an apology. I meticulously crafted a message of utter broken surrender. I told him I was exhausted. I admitted that the sudden pause on my Sentinel Logistics contract had terrified me. I confessed that I simply could not afford to lose the data consultancy I had spent my entire adult life building. I promised him I would sign the retroactive intellectual property transfer and formally legitimize Melissa's academic claim to my algorithm. However, I included one strict, non-negotiable condition to my capitulation. I insisted that the document signing could not happen in the private, informal setting of his residential study. I demanded a formal, officially sanctioned meeting on the university campus, attended by the relevant academic deans and their institutional legal counsel. I framed the request as a desperate need for finality. I told Thomas I wanted the transfer process through official legal channels, so it was entirely clean, legally binding, and guaranteed that he would lift his aggressive embargo against my business. His response arrived less than 3 minutes later. The tone of his message radiated a smug, unfiltered triumph. He did not question my sudden compliance. He simply accepted it as the natural, inevitable outcome of his patriarchal authority. Thomas genuinely believed he had crushed my resistance. He believed that applying economic pressure had easily broken the spirit of the daughter he always viewed as inferior. The 30-year illusion that I was weak, compliant, and ultimately subservient to the golden child completely blinded him to the possibility of a trap. His breathtaking arrogance became the exact weapon I needed to ensure he gathered the necessary witnesses for his own execution. He confirmed the meeting was scheduled for Friday morning in a primary boardroom on the Cambridge campus. While Thomas prematurely celebrated his victory, I retreated back into the shadows of my encrypted network. Behind the facade of my surrender, Priya and I initiated the silent, dangerous preparation for the impending meeting. The tension tightening in my chest was not fueled by confidence. It was fueled by the terrifying reality that my survival now depended entirely on maneuvering within massive institutions I did not control. I was a small, independent tech consultant preparing to detonate a bomb inside an Ivy League university and a federal lending investigation. The margin for error was non-existent. I needed unassailable ammunition. I isolated the high-resolution photograph I had taken of the forged intellectual property acknowledgement Thomas had presented in his study. The document bore a date stamp from 2 years ago, attempting to legally establish my role as an unpaid research assistant long before the current crisis erupted. I uploaded the image into my proprietary provenance verification software. I ran a deep forensic analysis on the digital artifact, instructing the system to strip away the superficial layers of ink and paper to expose the underlying creation metadata. The software hummed, running aggressive diagnostic algorithms to determine the exact origin point and the true chronological timestamp of the forgery. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, securing the cryptographic proof of fabrication. The resulting data packet was devastating, but I locked the results away in a secured partition of my hard drive, withholding the specific dates until the trap was fully sprung. My technical defense was armed, but I still faced a massive legal vulnerability. Priya, constrained by the strict ethical boundaries of her federal compliance firm, could not officially represent me in the Cambridge boardroom. Acting as my advocate would constitute a severe conflict of interest, potentially jeopardizing her own career if the federal grant investigation escalated into a sprawling criminal indictment. She remained my silent, tactical advisor, but I needed a physical gladiator to handle the university council. Late on Thursday afternoon, Priya sent me a highly encrypted message containing a single contact file. She provided a name and a direct phone number, describing the individual only as a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in white-collar defense and institutional accountability. She promised me this attorney did not intimidate easily and despised academic corruption. I made the call, retaining the unseen legal muscle necessary to survive the impending ambush. The night before the meeting, the adrenaline that had sustained me for days finally began to crash, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room. The rain had returned, beating a slow, dreary rhythm against the large windows of my apartment. My laptop rested closed on the coffee table, the digital ammunition locked safely inside. I picked up a small silver-framed photograph resting on the end table. It was the only picture of my family I still displayed. It was an old, faded image taken during a rare, peaceful summer on Cape Cod. I was 10 years old, sporting a bruised knee from a bicycle accident. Melissa, 13, and unbothered by her pristine white sundress, was kneeling in the dirt beside me, pressing a colorful bandage onto my scrape with fierce protective concentration. It captured the brief, beautiful alliance we shared before the relentless pressure of our father's expectations mutated her into a thief and relegated me to the shadows. I stared at the smiling faces of the two young girls, a profound, heavy ache settling deep in my chest. The weight of the impending destruction felt immense. I was preparing to walk into a room and actively trigger the total annihilation of my family's social and financial existence. The fallout would be irreversible. Thomas would face prison. Melissa would lose her academic future and the only identity she had ever known, the lingering ghost of the lie. I had internalized for 3 decades, whispered a seductive, terrifying alternative from the dark corners of the room. It offered a seemingly painless escape route. I could simply keep my head down. I could walk into the Cambridge boardroom tomorrow, sit quietly at the mahogany table, and sign the transfer documents exactly as Thomas demanded. I could surrender the algorithm, sacrifice my pride, and let them quietly win. By folding, I would immediately secure the survival of my data consultancy. Thomas would lift the embargo, the Sentinel contract would resume, and my 12 employees would keep their jobs. I could fade back into my comfortable, isolated existence, completely avoiding the catastrophic federal fallout and the agonizing public spectacle of destroying my own father and sister. The lie promised me safety at the cost of my soul. I sat in the silent, empty apartment, staring at the childhood photograph, the deafening quiet offering no answers. The digital clock on my microwave ticked past midnight. I did not speak the choice out loud. The rain continued to fall, leaving the decision suspended in the cold, uncertain dark. The sharp autumn wind coming off the Charles River bit through my thin coat as I walked across the historic Cambridge campus. The sprawling green lawns and imposing brick architecture projected an aura of centuries-old, untouchable prestige. I navigated the labyrinth of academic buildings until I reached the administrative center. The conference room designated for our meeting was a massive, imposing space. Heavy oak paneling lined the walls, absorbing the ambient sound, and a long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the floor. Oil portraits of past university presidents glared down from the walls, reinforcing the suffocating weight of institutional authority. I walked into the room entirely alone. I wore an unbranded, simple charcoal suit carrying a standard leather tote bag. I deliberately stripped away any visual markers of wealth or corporate success. I wanted to look exactly like the compliant, defeated mid-level tech worker they fully expected me to be. Thomas and Melissa were already seated on one side of the massive table. My father leaned back in his expensive leather chair, checking his gold watch with a look of supreme, arrogant impatience. He barely glanced in my direction as I entered, treating my arrival as an inevitable formality. Melissa sat stiffly beside him, wearing a conservative navy blazer. She kept her eyes glued to the legal pad resting in front of her, desperately avoiding my gaze. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her knuckles were stark white. Sitting at the head of the table, flanked by 2 sharp-looking institutional lawyers, was Dean Abbott. The dean was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, projecting the polished intellectual superiority characteristic of elite academia. He offered a tight, clinically courteous smile as I took my seat opposite my family. He did not offer me coffee or engage in small talk. He operated with the chilling efficiency of a man eager to finalize a tedious bureaucratic transaction and protect his university from bad press. "We are glad you decided to cooperate, Ms. Evans." The dean began, his tone smooth and heavily patronized. "Resolving this intellectual property misunderstanding quickly is in the best interest of all parties involved. We have prepared the necessary transfer documents to formally solidify the university's legal standing regarding the predictive algorithm utilized in Melissa's research." He gestured to one of the lawyers, who efficiently slid a thick, stapled packet of legal documents across the polished mahogany. The packet stopped right in front of my hands. I looked down at the top page, expecting to see the standard non-disclosure agreement and the intellectual property transfer my father had demanded. But the ambush did not wait for my compliance. Before I could even reach for the packet, the villain sprang a devastating, highly coordinated trap that entirely upended the tactical balance of the room. This was not a simple surrender negotiation. It was an aggressive, preemptive execution. The dean reached into his leather portfolio and extracted a secondary set of documents. He placed them deliberately in the center of the table. Along with the intellectual property transfer, we are submitting this formal notarized affidavit into the permanent academic record, the dean stated, his voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. I stared at the paperwork. The top document was a high-resolution copy of the forged intellectual property acknowledgement Thomas had shown me in his study, the document falsely dated 2 years prior, bearing my fabricated signature. But the second document was new, and its contents hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a sworn, legally binding witness statement signed by a senior postdoctoral researcher from Melissa's own laboratory. The statement explicitly corroborated the fraudulent narrative my father had constructed. The researcher falsely testified under penalty of perjury that they had personally witnessed me working in the university lab, acting strictly as an unpaid subordinate coding assistant under Melissa's direct senior supervision. The institutional lawyers sat perfectly still, projecting silent, menacing confidence. They presented the fabricated evidence not as a debatable claim, but as concrete, settled institutional fact. They had successfully outmaneuvered me before I even opened my mouth. They had constructed a false reality so legally dense and heavily corroborated by university personnel that my undocumented truth felt instantly irrelevant. I felt a cold surge of genuine panic spike in my chest. "This is entirely fabricated," I stated, gripping the edge of the mahogany table to steady my hands. "I have never set foot inside her laboratory. That witness is lying, and that signature on the acknowledgement form is a blatant forgery. I have the digital provenance data to prove the algorithm originated on my private servers." The dean did not flinch. He did not look surprised or defensive. He simply cut me off with the brutal, crushing weight of procedural authority. "Your proprietary software logs are highly subjective, Ms. Evans," the dean countered smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. "You own a data security firm. It is well within your technical capabilities to manipulate digital metadata to serve your own financial interests. A judge would view your internal server logs as self-serving and heavily compromised. We, however, possess a sworn affidavit from a respected academic researcher and a signed contractual agreement. The narrative is legally established." He leaned forward, dropping the polite facade to reveal the sharp, coercive threat hiding underneath. "You will sign the transfer and the non-disclosure agreement right now," he commanded, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "If you refuse, or if you attempt to contest the origin of this algorithm in civil court, the university will not simply defend itself. We will actively pursue aggressive legal action against you for malicious interference with a federally funded research program." The silence in the boardroom became absolute. The threat was terrifyingly real and impeccably constructed. The dean was weaponizing the immense legal resources of an Ivy League institution to crush a small independent tech consultant. He was explicitly promising to turn my own evidence-gathering process into a formal accusation of corporate sabotage. If I fought them, they would use the fabricated witness statement to paint me as a bitter, unstable sister, trying to derail a multi-million-dollar government grant out of pure spite. They would bury my fragile company in frivolous, ruinous litigation. For a full, agonizing beat, the trap worked perfectly. The suffocating realization washed over me that I had vastly underestimated the depth of their corruption. I assumed I was fighting an arrogant father and a desperate sister. I did not realize I was fighting a heavily fortified academic machine. My digital provenance data, the undeniable proof I had banked my entire survival on, suddenly felt incredibly flimsy against the crushing weight of sworn institutional affidavits. The walls of the oak-paneled boardroom seemed to physically close in on me. Everyone sitting at that long mahogany table believed I was entirely finished. Thomas crossed his arms, a deeply satisfied, victorious smirk spreading across his face. I looked across the table at Melissa, expecting to see the cold, triumphant glare of the golden child who had finally vanquished her lifelong rival. I expected her to bask in the glow of her stolen victory. But when my eyes locked onto my sister, the narrative fractured. Melissa was not smirking. Her face was ashen, drained of all color. She was staring blankly at the polished wood of the table, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked physically sick. The sheer terror radiating from her posture was undeniable. In that moment of intense vulnerability, the truth snapped into clear, sharp focus. Melissa was not the architect of this monstrous legal ambush. She was sitting in that chair, paralyzed by fear, realizing the horrific magnitude of the federal crimes her father had orchestrated to protect his failing supply company. She was just as trapped in this nightmare as I was. My gaze drifted from my sister's trembling hands back to the documents resting in the center of the table. I stared at the forged intellectual property acknowledgement, my mind racing desperately for an exit strategy. Then my eyes caught a detail on a secondary document protruding slightly from beneath the dean's leather portfolio. It was a copy of the finalized federal defense grant approval form, the document justifying the massive influx of government funding based on the stolen algorithm. I had reviewed public snippets of this grant with Priya days ago. I knew it required the signature of the lead researcher and a senior university administrative official to validate the inflated financial projections. I stared at the bottom of the page, my focus zeroing in on the heavy dark ink of the administrative co-signature. The signature belonged to Dean Abbott. The final catastrophic puzzle piece dropped seamlessly into place, triggering a profound, sickening vertigo. The floor beneath my chair seemed to physically give out. The man sitting at the head of the table, the man aggressively threatening to destroy my life with university lawyers, was not acting as a neutral academic authority trying to resolve a student dispute. The dean had personally signed off on the fraudulent federal grant. He had tied his own administrative career and the prestige of his department directly to the stolen algorithm. He knew the financial valuation was artificially inflated to secure the government funding, and he had eagerly participated in the deception because his department desperately needed the federal cash. The fraud was not an isolated family incident. It was deeply, rotly institutional. The dean was Thomas's active co-conspirator. He was orchestrating this aggressive legal ambush not to protect Melissa, but to desperately bury his own exposure to federal wire fraud and violations of the False Claims Act. If the origin of the algorithm was questioned, the Federal Oversight Committee would audit the grant, and the dean would face immediate termination and potential criminal indictment. The profound terror I felt just moments ago vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. I was sitting in a room full of powerful, arrogant men who believed they held all the cards. They assumed my silence indicated total shattered compliance. The dean slid a heavy silver pen across the mahogany table. It rolled smoothly, coming to a halt directly in front of my hands. "Sign the documents, Ms. Evans," the dean reiterated, his voice carrying the impatient edge of a man eager to finalize his own salvation. "Let us conclude this matter and move forward." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the smug, victorious face of my father. I slowly reached my hand out, hovering over the polished wood. But I did not reach for the pen. Instead, my fingers curled tightly around the sturdy leather strap of the heavy tote bag resting by my ankle. The room waited in breathless, suspended silence, watching my hand, entirely unsure if I was reaching for the documents to surrender or if I was finally arming the explosive I had brought into the room. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The silver pen rested untouched on the polished mahogany. I kept my hand firmly wrapped around the leather strap of my tote bag. Thomas let out a sharp, impatient sigh, shifting his weight in his expensive leather chair. He interpreted my hesitation as the final pathetic struggle of a defeated woman. The dean leaned forward, tapping his manicured index finger against the edge of the transfer document, silently demanding my immediate compliance. I did not sign the document. With slow, deliberate precision, I hoisted the heavy leather tote bag onto my lap. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my ultra-slim encrypted laptop. I placed the machine squarely on the table, the metallic chassis clicking softly against the wood. The smug, victorious expression surrounding me faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a subtle ripple of confusion. Before I sign a document carrying such immense legal weight, I stated, my voice stripping away any remaining pretense of intimidation, I require a definitive verification of the materials presented in this room. The dean frowned, his authoritative facade tightening. The documents have been vetted by our internal legal counsel, Ms. Evans. Further verification is entirely unnecessary and a waste of institutional time. I ignored his objection. I reached across the table and grasped the thick connection cable linking to the boardroom's massive high-definition projector. I plugged the cable directly into my machine. The enormous screen mounted on the far wall flared to life, illuminating the dark oak paneling with the stark, bright interface of my proprietary software dashboard. I build digital provenance architecture. I explained, typing my access credentials with steady, unhurried keystrokes. It is the primary service my consultancy provides to corporate clients. Interestingly enough, Dean Abbott, it is also the exact same foundational technology this university licenses to run routine plagiarism screening on doctoral submissions. I assume you trust the integrity of your own academic software. The two institutional lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were highly trained litigators, and they recognized the sudden shift in the room's power dynamic. They knew that a subject matter expert booting up a diagnostic tool in the middle of a hostile negotiation was a massive red flag. I accessed the high-resolution digital scans I had taken of the forged intellectual property acknowledgement and the sworn witness affidavit. I dragged the files onto the projector screen, enlarging them for the entire room to see. To the naked eye, the documents looked flawless. The dates were printed clearly indicating they had been drafted and signed 2 years ago. Let us examine the structural integrity of your evidence, I announced, executing the primary diagnostic command. The provenance software bypassed the superficial layers of text and ink, diving deep into the embedded metadata of the digital files. The screen fractured into a complex grid of coding timelines and creation signatures. I did not need flashy graphics or dramatic cinematic effects. The raw data spoke with brutal, undeniable clarity. The forged intellectual property acknowledgement, the document Thomas claimed I signed 2 years ago to surrender my work, unspooled on the screen. The encrypted creation timestamp, highlighted in stark black text, revealed the absolute truth. The digital document had not been created 2 years ago. The metadata proved it was generated exactly 11 days ago, matching the precise timeline of my father's frantic panic after the initial phone call from the university. Thomas stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack as he stared at the screen, watching his felony forgery exposed in front of 2 institutional lawyers. I did not pause to let him recover. I shifted the diagnostic tool to analyze the sworn witness affidavit, the supposedly independent statement corroborating my role as an unpaid assistant. The software stripped away the formatting and traced the origin of the digital file creation. The routing data did not point to a secondary laboratory computer or a graduate student terminal. The metadata traced the origin of the document directly to the primary administrative terminal located inside the dean's private office suite. The revelation hit the boardroom with the force of a physical strike. The dean had not simply received a corroborating statement from an independent researcher. He had actively participated in drafting the fraudulent testimony from his own desk. He had manufactured the evidence to solidify the trap. The erratic, contradictory behavior the dean had displayed over the past week suddenly aligned with terrifying logic. When the Federal Review Board initially flagged the algorithm, the dean had called Thomas not out of a genuine desire for academic integrity, but in a state of sheer panic. He raised the flag only because he desperately needed to contain the fallout. He knew the financial valuation attached to the algorithm was vastly inflated, and he knew that securing the federal grant based on stolen code implicated the university in massive fraud. When I refused to quietly sign the transfer in my father's study, the dean realized containment was failing. He orchestrated this aggressive, intimidating boardroom ambush as a final desperate maneuver to bury his own complicity and force my silence through institutional terror. The illusion of neutral academic authority shattered completely. The dean was not a mediator protecting the university from a bitter sibling dispute. He was Thomas's active co-conspirator. The atmosphere in the room turned instantly toxic. The two institutional lawyers tasked with protecting the university's legal standing stared at the metadata displayed on the projector screen. Their professional survival instincts kicked in with ruthless speed. The senior lawyer did not say a word. He simply placed his hands on his armrests and quietly, deliberately pushed his heavy leather chair backward, physically distancing himself from the dean and the fraudulent documents resting on the table. He was silently severing his legal association with a man who had just been caught fabricating evidence. I turned my attention back to the laptop. The defensive dismantling of their forgery was complete. It was time to deploy the final, irrefutable truth. I opened a secure encrypted folder containing the original unaltered source code for my predictive routing algorithm. I projected the core directory onto the massive screen. I ran the provenance verification tool one last time. I did not use theatrics. I simply let the software extract the foundational authorship signature embedded deep within the code architecture. The screen displayed a plain, unadorned line of text. It showed my full legal name, my verified biometric access credentials, and a concrete, undeniable timestamp, proving I had finalized the algorithm months before Melissa even proposed her doctoral thesis topic. The understatement of the plain text was its ultimate power. There were no flashing red lights or dramatic sirens. It was just cold, hard, inescapable mathematics, proving that I owned the creation, and they had attempted a massive coordinated theft. For the first time since I entered the room, Dean Abbott's pristine composure cracked. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to adjust his tie, realizing that his prestigious career, his tenure, and his freedom were rapidly evaporating under the harsh glare of the projector screen. Thomas stared blankly at the mahogany table, unable to look at the lawyers or the dean, his arrogant posture completely deflated by the catastrophic exposure of his crimes. I stood at the edge of the table looking at the broken, terrified men who had spent the last hour trying to destroy my life. I waited for the surge of euphoric triumph I had imagined since childhood. I waited for the rush of vindication, the joyful realization that I had finally proven my intellectual superiority to the father who had mocked me for decades. But as I looked down at my own hands resting steadily on the keyboard, I felt absolutely no joy. There was no triumphant fanfare playing in my mind. I felt only a profound, freezing clarity. The heavy, suffocating lie I had carried inside my chest for 30 years, that my worth was entirely dependent on their validation, finally loosened its grip. I had not proven my brilliance to them. I had proven my brilliance despite them. Their acknowledgement was entirely irrelevant. The desperate need for my father to finally admit I was smart evaporated into the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of the boardroom. I did not need his pride. I had my own. The projected metadata illuminated the dark oak panels of the boardroom, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the fabricated documents. The silence was thick, oppressive, and heavily saturated with impending legal ruin. I did not raise my voice or resort to theatrical shouting. I did not need to scream to command the space. The raw, undeniable truth displayed on the screen was a far more effective weapon. I stepped away from the laptop, pacing slowly along the length of the mahogany table, forcing every person in the room to track my movement. I systematically dismantled their sprawling conspiracy, laying out the exact architecture of their fraud with the clinical precision of a seasoned auditor presenting a final report. Let us clearly establish the exact nature of the liabilities present in this room. I began, my voice echoing evenly across the heavy silence. I am not throwing around vague accusations of academic misconduct. I am identifying highly specific documented federal crimes. I looked directly at Melissa, who was shrinking back into her leather chair, her eyes wide and bloodshot. You bypass the grueling labor required for your doctoral thesis by simply stealing proprietary software architecture from my private servers. You submitted stolen code to an Ivy League committee to fraudulently obtain your degree. That is textbook academic fraud. It is grounds for immediate expulsion and the permanent revocation of your academic standing. I paused, letting the reality of her shattered academic career sink into the room before turning my attention to the men sitting at the head of the table. But the theft of the code is merely the foundation of the true crisis. The situation rapidly escalated into severe criminal exposure when this university utilized the stolen algorithm to secure external funding. I pointed to the projection of the defense grant approval form, specifically highlighting the section detailing the inflated financial valuation of the software. Your laboratory actively leveraged my proprietary work to justify a multi-million-dollar advanced research grant funded by a federal defense program. You submitted falsified asset valuations to a government agency. In the eyes of the Department of Justice, submitting false statements to a federal program to secure funding constitutes a severe violation of the False Claims Act. You exposed this entire institution to staggering federal liability. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, attempting to look away from the glaring screen, but I refused to let him hide. And then we have your contribution to this disaster, Thomas. I continued, locking my gaze onto my father. You did not just cheer for your golden child from the sidelines. You actively weaponized the stolen algorithm to save your failing commercial supply company. You fraudulently listed my proprietary intellectual property as a primary corporate asset to secure a $3 million commercial loan from a Boston bank. You used a fabricated academic achievement to commit undeniable, federally actionable bank fraud. I turned my focus entirely on Dean Abbott, the man who had orchestrated this ambush in a desperate bid for self-preservation. You panicked when the Federal Review Board flagged the copyright discrepancy. You knew the financial valuation attached to the grant was wildly inflated, and you knew that securing federal cash based on stolen code implicated your department in a massive fraud scheme. Your countersignature is sitting right there on the grant approval documents, permanently tying your administrative authority to the misrepresentation. That is exactly why you needed me silenced today. You drafted a forged witness affidavit from your own office terminal, attempting to coerce me into validating the theft, all to bury your own complicity in defrauding a federal agency. The dean swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically above his crisp collar. He glanced nervously at the two institutional lawyers sitting beside him. The lawyers maintained their strategic, stony silence. They were taking rapid, meticulous notes on legal pads, actively building an internal defense strategy for the university that clearly did not include protecting the dean. I made sure to proactively close the only remaining loophole they might attempt to exploit. I understand that my delayed response to the initial theft might appear problematic. I stated addressing the lawyers directly to establish my own legal immunity. I discovered the unauthorized duplication 2 years ago through routine security alerts. I admit my own internal family dynamics paralyzed my response. I chose not to report the theft immediately. However, I have never received a single dollar of compensation, academic credit, or professional benefit from the stolen algorithm. I have meticulously documented the timeline of discovery, and I gathered this current evidence using strictly lawful, publicly available disclosures under the guidance of a federal compliance attorney. I am the sole victim of intellectual property theft, and my hands are entirely clean. The presentation was complete. I had laid out a flawless, legally coherent map of their sprawling conspiracy. There were no exaggerated claims of treason, only cold, hard statutes that carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Dean Abbott realized the institutional lawyers had abandoned him. He realized his tenure, his reputation, and his freedom were rapidly evaporating. He attempted one final desperate maneuver to salvage his life. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the mahogany table, attempting to project an aura of calm, measured reason. He dropped the hostile, authoritative tone, replacing it with a sickeningly smooth cadence designed to broker a secret truce. Ms. Evans, the dean, said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. You have presented a very compelling and highly concerning narrative. The potential fallout for everyone involved, including your own family, would be catastrophic if these allegations were made public. Federal investigations are notoriously messy and destructive. They ruin legacies. He paused, offering a tight, forced smile. We are all reasonable professionals in this room. The university possesses significant discretionary funds dedicated to resolving sensitive intellectual property disputes. We can make this entire situation quietly disappear. If you agree to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement today, relinquishing your claim to the algorithm and permanently sealing the details of this meeting, the university will provide you with a highly lucrative, untraceable settlement. You can walk away with enough capital to secure your consultancy's future, your family avoids prison, and the institution protects its reputation. It is a mutually beneficial resolution. He was offering a bribe disguised as institutional mercy. He wanted to buy my silence to bury his own crimes, banking on the assumption that I would prioritize my financial security and my family's freedom over justice. It was the ultimate moral fork in the road. I looked at the dean, recognizing the exact same manipulative tactic my father had employed for decades. They both operated under the fundamental belief that my compliance could be bought, bullied, or bargained for. They assumed my deepest desire was simply to survive in the shadows without causing a disruption. I am declining your generous offer, Dean Abbott, I replied, my voice steady and resolute. I did not deliver a dramatic cinematic one-liner. I simply spoke the truest thing I knew. You spent this entire meeting assuming I would rather be safe than seen. You assumed I would take a payout to quietly disappear and avoid a messy confrontation. My father made that exact same bet for 30 years. You both severely miscalculated the cost of my silence. I am not hiding anymore, and I am certainly not signing a non-disclosure agreement to protect a criminal conspiracy. The power dynamic in the room fully and permanently inverted. The two institutional lawyers ceased taking notes. The senior attorney finally spoke, his voice clipped and highly professional. He did not address the dean or my father. He spoke exclusively to me. Ms. Evans, the attorney, stated, sliding his chair slightly to face me directly. Please be advised that the university takes these allegations of academic and financial fraud with the utmost seriousness. The individuals currently seated at this table do not speak for the legal interests of this institution. We will be launching an immediate comprehensive internal investigation into the grant approval process and the actions of the administrative staff involved. The lawyers were officially representing the university's survival against the dean and Thomas. The alliance of the powerful men had completely shattered. Dean Abbott slumped back in his chair, defeated, realizing he had just been functionally ousted by his own legal counsel. Thomas stared at his hands, his arrogant posture replaced by the hollow, trembling reality of a man facing total financial ruin and federal bank fraud charges. The room belonged to me. Yet amidst the crushing weight of the exposed conspiracy and the frantic scrambling of the men at the table, one thread remained taut and unresolved. I turned my gaze back to Melissa. My sister had not spoken a single word since I projected the metadata onto the screen. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed blankly on the polished mahogany surface. She was gripping the armrests of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. The sheer terror radiating from her was palpable, but there was something else hiding beneath her panic. I watched the subtle, erratic pulse jumping in her neck. I saw the way her jaw clenched tightly, as if she were desperately holding back a tidal wave. She was holding something back. As I studied her pale, rigid face, a deep, unsettling instinct flared in my chest. The sprawling map of fraud I had just laid bare was accurate, but it was incomplete. Melissa was harboring a final, devastating secret, and I knew the absolute worst revelation had not yet surfaced. The absolute silence in the boardroom was finally shattered by the frantic, panicked scrambling of a man attempting to outrun a federal indictment. Thomas realized the institutional lawyers had firmly drawn a line in the sand, officially isolating the university from his fraudulent commercial loan. The pristine, untouchable aura of the Boston businessman evaporated entirely. He bolted upright from his leather chair, the heavy wood scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at Melissa, attempting to sacrifice his golden child to save his own skin. She acted entirely alone. Thomas bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. I had absolutely no idea she stole the algorithm. I am a victim of her deception. She presented the software to my company as her own original peer-reviewed academic creation. I merely utilized an asset she legally claimed she owned. I am completely innocent of this copyright theft. The cowardly betrayal hit the room with stunning velocity. Thomas was perfectly willing to let his favorite daughter take the sole fall for federal grant fraud and intellectual property theft, hoping his feigned ignorance would shield him from the bank fraud charges. The blatant, desperate lie served as the final catalyst. Melissa had spent her entire existence maintaining the exhausting, flawless facade of the brilliant prodigy. She had contorted her life to meet the impossible demands of her father's ego. Hearing the man she had sacrificed her own integrity to please casually discard her to the authorities broke the last remaining pillar of her sanity. Melissa did not shout. She did not throw a dramatic performative tantrum. She simply cracked. A low, jagged sob escaped her throat, a raw sound of genuine, unadulterated collapse. She slowly lifted her head, looking at the man frantically trying to disown her. "You knew," Melissa whispered, her voice trembling, but carrying a terrifying, hollow clarity. "You knew exactly what it was." Thomas stiffened, his eyes darting nervously toward the institutional lawyers. "Be quiet, Melissa," he hissed, his tone a dangerous warning. "Do not say another word without legal representation. I stole the code because I was drowning." Melissa continued ignoring his command, her gaze fixed entirely on the polished mahogany table. "I was failing the doctoral program. I could not understand the computational models. I visited your apartment that night, Nadia, because I was desperate. I took the algorithm just to pass a single preliminary review. I thought I could reverse engineer it later and replace it with my own work. I just needed to survive the semester." She paused, wiping a tear that spilled over her eyelashes. She was confirming the initial theft taking ownership of the original crime. But the narrative did not stop there. It escalated, revealing a much darker, far more sinister manipulation that perfectly bridged the gap between academic desperation and federal financial fraud. When the preliminary review committee praised the code, I panicked. Melissa confessed, her voice gaining a desperate, frantic momentum. "I went to Dad. I told him everything. I confessed that I stole the architecture from your private server. I begged him to let me drop out of the program quietly before the university requested a full structural audit of the software. I wanted to walk away." She turned her tear-streaked face toward Thomas, exposing the true architect of the sprawling conspiracy. "But you did not let me stop," she said, her voice breaking. "You realized how valuable the algorithm actually was. You realized the predictive routing models could generate millions in licensing revenue. You told me that if I dropped out and confessed the theft, you would cut me off entirely. You promised to completely disown me and ensure I never worked in academia again." The institutional lawyers resumed taking rapid, meticulous notes. The narrative was shifting from a simple case of student plagiarism into a documented case of severe coercion and organized corporate fraud. "You weaponized my fear." Melissa sobbed, the heavy, suffocating truth finally pouring out of her. "You forced me to submit the stolen code for the final thesis defense. You personally pushed me to apply for the federal defense grant, using your connections with Dean Abbott to expedite the inflated valuation. You knew exactly what you were doing. You used my stolen academic credibility as a smokescreen so you could legally list the algorithm as a corporate asset on your commercial loan applications. You held my entire future hostage to save your bankrupt supply company. Melissa was both a thief and a hostage. She was undeniably guilty of the initial academic theft, driven by the crushing weight of her father's expectations. But she was actively coerced into the massive escalating federal crimes. Thomas had industrialized her desperation, turning a stolen thesis into a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme. Thomas opened his mouth to launch another denial, but the words died in his throat. The sheer volume of specific corroborating detail Melissa just delivered in front of University Council rendered his defensive lies entirely useless. He sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the floor, finally realizing the inescapable magnitude of his impending prison sentence. Melissa turned her head away from our father. She looked directly across the wide mahogany table, locking her red, tear-filled eyes onto mine. The haughty, condescending superiority she had worn like armor for decades was completely stripped away. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly exhausted. She was a woman who had spent her entire life believing she was a genius, only to realize her entire identity was a hollow, fabricated ghost. Admitting the fraud meant admitting she had never truly existed. "They told me I had to be smarter than you," Melissa whispered, her voice thick with a profound decades-old sorrow. "From the time we were children, Dad made it a contest. He told me that my only value was being the exceptional one. I built my entire life proving something that was never even true." She reached across the table, her trembling fingers stopping just short of my laptop. "I spent years watching you quietly build your own company from a drafty stockroom." She continued, the raw honesty of her confession tearing through the quiet boardroom. "You never needed their approval. You never needed the expensive tutors or the Ivy League tuition. You possessed the actual brilliance they spent 30 years trying to force out of me." A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "You were the smart one," Nadia Melissa said, her voice breaking on the final, devastating truth. "I stole your work because I finally believed them. I believed I was a failure and I needed a piece of your genius just to survive the pressure." The words hung in the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of the boardroom. The golden child had finally spoken the exact sentence I had spent my entire life yearning to hear. The lifelong comparison that had poisoned our childhood was officially permanently dead. She had admitted my superiority. She had validated my intellect in front of powerful elite witnesses. I waited for the rush of victorious vindication. I waited for the triumphant satisfaction of finally defeating the sister who had overshadowed me for 3 decades. I expected to feel like a conquering general standing over a vanquished enemy. Instead, a heavy, suffocating wave of ancient, nameless grief washed over my chest. I stared at Melissa's trembling shoulders and saw a sudden, vivid flash of a 12-year-old girl in a white sundress fiercely stepping in front of our raging father to take the blame for a shattered crystal vase. I remembered the quiet ally who had sat on the stairs with me, picking up broken glass in the dark. The comparison had not just destroyed my self-worth, it had completely destroyed her reality. The relentless toxic pressure from Thomas had mutated the sister who once protected me into a desperate, hollow thief. The golden child was just as broken, just as manipulated, and just as deeply wounded by the exact same father. My hands remained perfectly steady on the table, but my heart ached with a profound, bitter realization. The 30-year war for intellectual supremacy was a manufactured lie. We were both just casualties of a man who demanded perfection to feed his own fragile ego. Winning against Melissa was never the point. She was not the enemy I needed to defeat. The true victory lay in breaking the cycle entirely, and the final choice of how to wield my absolute power was resting squarely in my hands. The air in the Cambridge boardroom hung stagnant and heavy, saturated with the metallic taste of absolute ruin. The sprawling conspiracy was entirely exposed, illuminated by the harsh glare of the projector screen and the raw, unvarnished confessions echoing off the oak-paneled walls. I sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table, the undisputed architect of this moment. I held absolute, unmitigated power over every single person in the room. I possessed the digital evidence, the legal strategy, and the leverage to orchestrate a catastrophic, indiscriminate slaughter. For one dark, seductive fraction of a second, the lie I had carried since childhood flared with blinding intensity. A voice deep inside my chest, born of 30 years of relentless mockery and isolation, demanded maximum vengeance. It whispered that true victory required scorching the earth completely. It urged me to let the federal authorities tear the university apart, to watch Thomas rot in a maximum security cell, to let Melissa face the full, unmitigated wrath of the Department of Defense, and to plunge my entire family into absolute, irreversible destitution. Make them suffer exactly as much as I did. Make them feel the precise weight of the insignificance they forced upon me. It was a powerful, intoxicating temptation. But as I looked at Melissa sobbing quietly into her hands, entirely broken by the impossible expectations that had defined her existence, the lie lost its grip. Destroying her completely would not validate my intellect. It would simply prove that I had allowed my father's toxic worldview to fundamentally infect my own soul. Justice is not a blunt, unthinking machine designed to inflict maximum pain. True sacred justice requires the ability to wield absolute power and actively choose a measured, precise restraint. I turned my attention to the two institutional lawyers sitting rigidly near the head of the table. They were staring at me, braced for a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit that would generate years of devastating public headlines for their prestigious university. I am not interested in burning this academic institution to the ground. I stated, my voice steady and deliberately calm, slicing through the frantic tension in the room. The university as a broader entity was manipulated by individuals acting entirely in their own self-interest. I will provide you with a clean structural off-ramp to mitigate the institutional damage. The senior lawyer leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with cautious relief. What are your terms, Ms. Evans? My terms are non-negotiable and require immediate compliance, I replied, closing my laptop to signal the end of the presentation phase. The university will actively and fully cooperate with the ongoing federal investigation into the fraudulent defense grant. You will not attempt to obstruct the oversight committee or bury the financial discrepancies. Furthermore, the university will issue a formal public retraction of Melissa's doctoral thesis, and you will publicly restore the authorship and proprietary copyright of the predictive algorithm exclusively to my name. The lawyer nodded slowly, recognizing the incredible leniency I was offering. You are asking for institutional transparency and the correction of the academic record. If you are willing to waive civil damages against the university, those terms are highly acceptable. We will facilitate the transition immediately. But I am not signing a non-disclosure agreement, I added, shifting my gaze directly onto Dean Abbott. The dean was still sitting frozen in his chair, his face a pale mask of impending career termination. I will not accept a quiet settlement to protect the individuals who orchestrated this fraud. The institutional liability may be resolved, but the personal accountability remains absolute. You attempted to bribe me with university funds to bury a federal crime, Dean Abbott. Your actions will be fully detailed in the evidence packet I provide to the authorities. Justice cannot be bought in this room today. I turned my focus back to my family. Thomas was staring blankly at the polished wood, completely paralyzed by the realization that his grand, arrogant bluff had resulted in his total financial and legal annihilation. He had built his identity on the perception of elite Boston wealth, and I had just handed him a one-way ticket to federal bank fraud charges. I felt no pity for him. He was the architect of his own destruction, a man who industrialized his daughter's desperation to cover his own profound incompetence. I would hand the digital proof of his collateral fraud directly to the federal investigators without a single moment of hesitation. But I drew a distinct, deliberate line around my sister. I looked at Melissa, who was still trembling, her posture radiating absolute defeat. She was guilty of stealing my work, a crime driven by a crushing manufactured insecurity. But she was not the mastermind behind the sprawling federal conspiracy. She was coerced into the escalation held hostage by a father who threatened to erase her existence if she did not comply with his money laundering scheme. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Priya's secure number. I placed the device on speakerphone, setting it on the table so the entire room could hear the conclusion of my strategy. "Priya," I said, maintaining my cold professional cadence, "the meeting is concluded. The digital provenance of the algorithm is verified, and the extent of the federal grant fraud is fully exposed. You may proceed with the formal submission of the unredacted evidence packet to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division and the Defense Grant Oversight Committee." "Understood." Nadia Priya's sharp voice crackled through the speaker. "The transmission will be executed immediately. The authorities have been standing by for confirmation. When you submit the documentation," I continued, ensuring my words echoed clearly off the oak-paneled walls, "I need you to attach a formal sworn addendum from me regarding Melissa's involvement. I will provide truthful, irrefutable evidence of her initial academic theft. She must face the consequences of the plagiarism. However, my addendum will also explicitly state that she was actively coerced and threatened into the subsequent federal grant escalation by Thomas." Melissa's head snapped up. Her tear-streaked face registered profound, unadulterated shock. She stared at me, completely unable to process why the sister she had robbed was actively intervening to mitigate her federal criminal exposure. "I am not excusing her theft, Priya," I clarified, keeping my eyes locked on Melissa. "But the federal prosecutors need to distinguish between a desperate student committing academic fraud and a businessman who industrialized that desperation to commit massive commercial bank fraud. The justice system must reflect the coercion." "I understand," Priya replied softly, recognizing the moral weight of the distinction I was drawing. "The addendum will be filed alongside the primary evidence." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. By extending a layer of fairness my family had never granted me, I definitively proved I was never the lesser child. I did not need to maximize her suffering to validate my own intelligence. Differentiating the desperate thief from the malicious architect was the ultimate manifestation of the truth overcoming the lie. I had finally broken the toxic cycle of comparison that defined our entire lives. I made one final quiet, tactical maneuver before concluding the meeting. Throughout my relentless forensic auditing of my father's commercial supply company and the fraudulent bank loans, I had meticulously searched for any digital signatures or authorization protocols linked to my mother. I scoured the corporate registries, the loan applications, and the real estate deeds. I found absolutely nothing. My mother was entirely passive, a woman who maintained the illusion of the happy Boston Brahmin household through willful, silent complicity. She knew nothing of the specific federal crimes, and she had signed none of the fraudulent documents. I had ensured that Priya completely redacted my mother's name from any peripheral involvement in the federal evidence packet. I refused to let an innocent, albeit deeply flawed woman be swept up in the criminal indictments. I would not replicate the original cruelty of punishing someone materially simply because they shared a last name with a monster. Her punishment would be moral, not legal. I gathered my laptop and placed it securely back into my leather tote bag. The heavy tension in the boardroom shifted from active conflict to the grim, silent wait for the inevitable federal fallout. I did not need to stay and watch the physical collapse of my father's empire. I did not need to savor the sight of steel handcuffs or relish the public humiliation of arrests on a university campus. The desperate need to spectate the downfall of my abusers belonged to a woman who still doubted her own worth. That woman no longer existed. I zipped my bag closed and stood up from the mahogany table. I did not offer a dramatic parting monologue or demand a final apology. The absolute refusal to engage further was my ultimate victory. I turned my back on the silent, broken men at the table and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the quiet, historic corridors of the Cambridge campus, walking out entirely on my own terms, finally and completely free. The heavy oak doors of the Cambridge boardroom clicked shut behind me, sealing the fate of the people inside. I walked out into the crisp New England air, feeling a profound, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. The explosive confrontation was over, but the actual machinery of justice was just beginning to grind into motion. The dismantling of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud and a federal defense grant scandal is never a swift cinematic montage resolved in an afternoon. It is a slow, methodical, and exhausting procedural war of attrition. The ensuing fallout stretched across 14 grueling months, demanding a relentless level of focus that fundamentally tested my endurance. Priya transitioned from a silent tactical advisor into my steadfast visible ally. Her expertise in federal compliance law proved invaluable as we navigated the endless maze of formal depositions, sworn affidavits, and rigorous interviews with agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We spent countless hours in sterile, windowless conference rooms downtown, meticulously walking federal prosecutors through the digital architecture of the stolen algorithm and the specific mechanics of the commercial collateral fraud. Priya's sharp, uncompromising presence shielded me from the aggressive posturing of defense attorneys attempting to discredit my timeline. She became a stabilizing anchor, a professional partnership built entirely on mutual respect and shared competence, replacing the toxic familial ties I had permanently severed. The retribution that slowly enveloped my father was not a fiery, explosive catastrophe. It was a cold, systematic, and entirely poetic dismantling of the exact illusion he had spent 30 years cultivating. Thomas built his entire identity on the perception of elite Boston Brahmin superiority. He thrived on claiming credit for accomplishments that were never truly his own, leveraging his daughter's supposed genius to mask his own profound financial incompetence. The justice system stripped him of that specific unearned audience. When the federal indictment regarding the fraudulent $3 million commercial loan became public record, the prestigious social circle he worshipped turned on him instantly. The bank aggressively accelerated the foreclosure protocols. The beloved Cape Cod summer home, the physical monument to his manufactured wealth, was seized and auctioned off to mitigate the institutional losses. His commercial supply company, already buckling under the weight of insolvency, filed for bankruptcy and dissolved completely. But the most devastating blow to his ego arrived in print. The prominent local business columnist, the exact man Thomas had threatened to weaponize against my fragile data consultancy just months prior, turned his investigative focus squarely onto the scandal. Unbeholden to a man stripped of his influence, the columnist published a scathing, comprehensive exposé detailing my father's desperate collateral fraud. He laid bare the pathetic reality of a patriarch willing to commit federal felonies to maintain a country club membership. Thomas was transformed from a respected business leader into a cautionary tale of reckless greed. His punishment was not merely legal. It was the total, irreversible evaporation of the audience he had performed for his entire life. He was left entirely alone, a hollow man drowning in the harsh, unforgiving light of public irrelevance. Dean Abbott faced a reckoning uniquely tailored to his specific brand of academic corruption. He was a man who had eagerly traded fundamental academic integrity for institutional prestige and federal funding. He believed his administrative authority rendered him immune to consequence. The Federal Oversight Committee disagreed. When the unredacted evidence packet revealed his active complicity in validating the stolen algorithm to secure the defense grant, his career imploded spectacularly. The university, desperate to shield itself from broader federal penalties, swiftly initiated termination proceedings. Dean Abbott was forced to resign in disgrace. The resignation was not handled quietly behind closed doors. The scandal leaked into major educational publications featuring high-resolution images of his countersignature on the fraudulent grant documents. The man who had sneered at me across the mahogany table, arrogantly threatening to destroy my livelihood, was publicly humiliated on a national academic stage. His legacy was permanently marked by the very theft he attempted to cover up, ensuring he would never hold a position of institutional power again. The resolution regarding Melissa required the most delicate navigation of justice. The federal prosecutors initially pursued an aggressive stance, eyeing severe penalties for her submission of the stolen software to a government program. However, the sworn addendum I had provided detailing Thomas's explicit coercion and the emotional hostage situation he engineered significantly altered the trajectory of her case. Priya forcefully advocated that a just outcome must distinguish between a desperate student committing academic theft and the malicious architect who industrialized her desperation. Melissa did not escape consequence. Her actions demanded accountability. The university formally and permanently revoked her doctoral degree, effectively ending her tenure-track aspirations. She was left with a permanent mark on her record, a scarlet letter in the academic community she had worshipped. She was required to participate in hundreds of hours of community service and pay restitution for the academic stipends she received under false pretenses. But she was not sent to rot in a federal penitentiary. The prosecutors, acknowledging her extensive cooperation and the documented environment of severe coercion, offered a plea agreement that avoided incarceration. It was a lesser resolution that felt deeply intrinsically just rather than merciful to a fault. Melissa was stripped of the unearned title of genius, but she was granted the rare, agonizing opportunity to begin her life again honestly and small. For a woman who had built her entire identity on a fabricated pedestal, the quiet, unglamorous reality of starting over from absolute zero was its own profound reckoning. She was forced to finally confront the person she actually was, rather than the illusion she was ordered to be. The 14 months of legal grinding concluded with a quiet, anticlimactic finality. There were no dramatic courtroom outbursts or tearful apologies. The system processed the crimes, distributed the penalties, and moved on to the next docket. I sat in my office overlooking the Boston harbor, reviewing the final closure documents Priya had forwarded. I felt a deep, resonant peace settling into my bones. The original toxic instinct that had flared inside me, the desire to see everyone maximally destroyed, had been entirely extinguished. I realized that the most satisfying retribution is not a blunt instrument of maximum cruelty. It is a precise mechanism that fits the crime like a key fits a lock. By choosing measured justice over blind vengeance, I exercised a form of power my villains never possessed. They operated on manipulation theft and the desperate need to crush anyone who challenged their fragile illusions. I operated on truth proportionality and the quiet strength of walking away intact. I closed the legal files on my monitor and leaned back in my chair. The heavy, dark chapter of my family's betrayal was officially closed. The legal battles were over, the assets were seized, and the reputations were ruined. Yet amidst the sterile finality of court orders and bankruptcy filings, one deeply personal, unresolved thread remained quietly waiting in the background. The structural damage was handled, but the emotional debris of my childhood required one final, delicate inspection before I could truly move forward. The formal legal proceedings had concluded, but the emotional debris field left in their wake still required navigation. The silence that followed the dismantling of my father's empire was heavy, yet it lacked the sharp, frantic energy of the previous 14 months. I was alone in my office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, reviewing security protocols for a new client when the intercom on my desk buzzed softly. My receptionist informed me that my mother Eleanor was waiting in the lobby. She had not called ahead. She simply arrived carrying the weight of the last 3 decades with her. Eleanor had always been a ghost in the architecture of my childhood. While Thomas boomed and dictated and Melissa performed under the crushing spotlight of his expectations, my mother existed in the quiet periphery. She was the woman who smoothed over the rough edges, poured the tea at Sunday dinners, and expertly changed the subject whenever Thomas launched into one of his tirades about my supposed inferiority. She never actively participated in the financial fraud. She never signed the forged documents or orchestrated the academic theft. Her weapon was not malice. Her weapon was absolute, unyielding silence. I authorized security to send her up. I did not feel the icy defensive armor slam into place as I usually did when dealing with my family. The threat of financial ruin and federal litigation was entirely gone. I was simply preparing to sit across from a woman who had watched me drown for 30 years without ever reaching out a hand. When the heavy glass doors of my office opened, Eleanor stepped inside cautiously. She looked visibly older, the stress of the bank foreclosures and the sudden brutal evaporation of her social standing etching deep lines around her eyes. She wore a simple, unbranded wool coat, entirely stripped of the ostentatious country club jewelry she used to favor. She looked around the expansive modern office, taking in the panoramic view of the Boston Harbor and the undeniable proof of my self-made success. Her eyes briefly widened, processing a reality she had actively ignored for my entire adult life. I gestured to the leather guest chairs positioned opposite my desk. She sat down slowly, keeping her handbag clutched tightly in her lap. The silence between us stretched thick with unspoken accusations and years of buried resentment. I did not initiate the conversation. I waited for her to articulate the purpose of her unannounced visit. "I suppose I owe you an apology, Nadia," Eleanor finally said, her voice quiet and fragile, devoid of the practiced aristocratic tone she usually employed. "The past year has been an absolute nightmare. Everything Thomas built is gone. The house, the accounts, our friends, it all vanished so quickly." I looked at her, recognizing the subtle attempt to frame herself as a bewildered victim of a sudden tragedy. I refused to let her seek refuge in ignorance. It did not vanish. "Mom," I corrected her gently, maintaining a steady, even gaze. "The bank reclaimed stolen collateral. The federal government seized fraudulent assets. It was an inevitable consequence of a massive crime, not a random act of fate. You are not a victim of a sudden disaster. You are a casualty of Thomas's profound arrogance." Eleanor flinched, gripping the handle of her purse tighter. "I know," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the polished walnut surface of the desk. "I know what he did. The lawyers explained everything during the bankruptcy hearings. The shell companies, the forged loans, the stolen code. It is horrifying." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She was waiting for me to offer comfort, waiting for me to absolve her of the guilt she was currently drowning in. She wanted the easy forgiveness that society dictates a daughter owes her mother. She wanted a tidy cinematic reconciliation to wash away the ugliness of the past. I did not offer it. Forgiveness requires genuine accountability, and I needed her to face the true cost of her complicity. "You knew he was crushing me," I stated softly, the words landing heavily in the quiet room. "You sat at that dining room table every single night for 30 years while he told me I was a failure. You watched me work overnight shifts in a freezing stockroom to pay for community college while he remortgaged the house to buy Melissa an Ivy League pedigree. You knew the narrative he was spinning was cruel and false, and you never once told him to stop." Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. The defensive posture she had maintained for decades finally shattered. The polite Boston Brahmin facade cracked open, revealing the terrifying, desperate truth underneath. I knew she confessed, her voice breaking into a ragged, painful sob. "I knew you were the gifted one, Nadia. I saw it when you were just a little girl taking apart radios and fixing the household computers while Melissa struggled with basic division. I saw your brilliance, and I saw how much it terrified your father." The admission hung in the air, a stunning, profound validation that I had desperately craved for a lifetime. But hearing it now, stripped of its power to heal me, it simply sounded tragic. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "If you knew I was smart, why did you let him convince me I was worthless?" "Because his approval was the only currency that mattered in our house," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling with the raw, ugly honesty of a woman finally facing her own weakness. "Thomas demanded a very specific reality. He needed a golden child to validate his own ego, and he chose Melissa because she was compliant. If I had defended you, if I had challenged his narrative, he would have turned his rage onto me. He would have cut me out financially and emotionally. I was terrified of losing the comfort, the security, the life he provided. I chose my own safety over protecting you. I sacrificed you to keep the peace." The confession was brutal, painful, and entirely true. She had not actively participated in the federal fraud, but she had been an active participant in my psychological destruction. She chose the path of least resistance, allowing my spirit to be crushed so she could maintain her country club luncheons and her quiet, undisturbed existence. It was a moral failure of catastrophic proportions. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the weight of her admission. The original, toxic urge to inflict maximal cruelty, the desire to see her destitute and shivering in a rundown apartment faded entirely. Punishing her materially for a moral failing would not bring me justice. It would simply make me vindictive. The true sacred justice lay in forcing her to live with the undeniable truth of her choices. I remember a Tuesday afternoon when I broke a crystal vase in the foyer. I said, shifting the conversation, bringing a long-buried memory to the surface. Dad stormed out of his office, his face purple with rage. He was ready to tear me apart. Eleanor wiped her cheek, her eyes widening slightly as she recalled the incident. "Yes," she murmured. "I was terrified he was going to hurt you." I looked at my mother, searching for the core of the dynamic that had defined our family. "But he didn't," I continued, "because Melissa stepped in front of me. She took the blame. She shielded me from his temper. We were allies that day, Mom. We were just two little girls trying to survive a volatile man." The memory hung between us, a tender, aching splinter of what could have been. "It didn't have to be a competition," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, sorrowful register. "The comparison wasn't a flaw inherent in Melissa or me. It was an engine Thomas built, and you helped him pour the fuel. You let him pit us against each other until we were both destroyed. You let a brilliant, protective older sister mutate into a desperate thief, and you let me believe I was garbage for 3 decades. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, weeping openly now, the full, devastating reality of her complicity crashing down upon her. She had lost her husband to a federal prison. Her golden child's reputation was in ruins, and she was sitting in the office of the daughter she had abandoned, finally recognizing the monstrous cost of her silence. I let her cry. I did not reach across the desk to hold her hand. I did not offer a sweeping declaration of forgiveness. The damage she allowed was too profound for a simple, tidy resolution. However, I also refused to destroy her. I refused to let the bitterness she helped cultivate dictate my future. "I am not going to cut you out of my life, Mom," I stated calmly, waiting for her to look up at me. She lowered her hands, her eyes red and swollen, a fragile glimmer of hope sparking in her gaze. "But we are not going to pretend the past 30 years didn't happen. I will not fund your lifestyle, and I will not help you rebuild the illusion Thomas created." I paused, ensuring the new boundaries were firmly, permanently established. "We can have a relationship. It will be limited, and it will be entirely honest. We will meet for coffee on my terms. We will speak the truth. You are going to have to learn how to exist in a reality where Thomas's approval no longer dictates the narrative." Eleanor nodded slowly, accepting the strict, unyielding terms I had just laid out. She understood that she was not being instantly redeemed. She was being granted a very small, very fragile opportunity to earn a place in my life, and she would have to carry the moral weight of her past choices every single day. She stood up from the leather guest chair, her posture lacking the arrogant rigidity it once held. She looked around my expansive, sunlit office one last time, a quiet, profound respect settling into her features. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the new reality, and walked toward the heavy glass doors. I watched her leave the door, clicking softly shut behind her. The meeting was over, and a profound tectonic shift settled deep within my mind. I finally understood the true, insidious origin of the lie I had battled my entire life. It was not just my father's booming voice telling me I was inferior. It was an entire household that had silently agreed to a toxic story simply because it was comfortable for them. They had built a reality that required my subjugation. Naming that reality, acknowledging the quiet complicity that sustained it, was the final necessary step in breaking free from its gravitational pull. The ghosts of my childhood were finally laid to rest, their power completely extinguished by the harsh, clarifying light of the truth. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors on my desk, ready to move forward, knowing that the deepest wounds were finally beginning to close. Yet the final, most complex emotional resolution still awaited me, a quiet conversation that required no lawyers, no evidence, and no audience. 7 months passed since the dramatic confrontation in the Cambridge boardroom. The dust from the federal indictments and the aggressive bank foreclosures had finally settled, leaving behind a stark, quiet reality. Thomas was serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary. The sprawling Cape Cod estate had been auctioned off its proceeds, absorbed by the bank he had defrauded. The grand, toxic illusion of our family's wealth was entirely erased from the Boston Social Registry. I spent those months burying myself in the expansion of my data security firm. The high-profile nature of the academic scandal and my undeniable role in exposing a massive federal fraud had inadvertently served as the ultimate advertisement for my proprietary provenance software. I secured the $50 million federal defense contract I had been striving for, stabilizing my company and ensuring my engineers were permanently insulated from any future economic threats. I had achieved the financial independence I had craved since I was a teenager working overnight shifts. I was safe and my business was thriving. Yet the final emotional ledger remained unbalanced until a crisp early spring afternoon when my receptionist informed me that a visitor was waiting in the lobby. The name on the visitor log was Melissa. The notification triggered a brief, sharp spike of adrenaline, a residual echo of the lifelong defensive posture I maintained around my sister. We had not spoken since the day she was escorted out of the university boardroom in steel handcuffs. I authorized her entry, mentally preparing for a tense, difficult confrontation. I expected her to arrive radiating resentment or perhaps offering a desperate, tearful plea for financial assistance now that her academic career was in ashes. When the heavy glass doors of my office swung open, the woman who walked in bore almost no resemblance to the polished, arrogant Ivy League scholar I remembered. Melissa looked profoundly ordinary. The expensive tailored blazers and designer accessories were gone, replaced by a simple gray sweater and practical jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore absolutely no makeup. The haughty, superior posture she had maintained for 3 decades had evaporated, revealing a quiet, exhausted humility. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 7 months carrying the heavy, agonizing burden of starting over from absolute zero. She did not bring an institutional lawyer. She did not carry a clipboard full of legal demands. She carried a single worn cardboard box. I gestured to the leather chairs opposite my desk, bypassing any formal, awkward pleasantries. She sat down slowly, placing the cardboard box carefully on the floor beside her ankle. The silence in the expansive, sunlit office was heavy, but it lacked the toxic, combative energy that used to define our interactions. We were sitting across from each other, not as the golden child and the scapegoat, but as 2 survivors of the same disastrous shipwreck. "I am not here to ask you for anything, Nadia." Melissa began, her voice steady but incredibly soft. "I know I haven't earned the right to ask for your forgiveness, and I am not expecting you to offer it. I just needed to bring you this." She reached down, lifted the cardboard box, and placed it squarely on the center of my polished walnut desk. She slid it gently across the surface toward me. I looked at the battered cardboard, a knot of confusion forming in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Open it," she replied, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. I reached forward and pulled back the folded cardboard flaps. I stared down into the box, my breath catching in my throat as a wave of intense, visceral nostalgia crashed over me. Resting on top of a stack of faded spiral notebooks was a cracked, obsolete laptop. The silver casing was scratched, and the hinge was slightly broken. It was the exact machine I had balanced on my knees in the freezing Walmart stockroom 15 years ago. Tucked beside the laptop was a faded blue plastic employee name badge bearing my first name. Beneath the hardware lay several thick, dog-eared notebooks, filled with my chaotic teenage handwriting, the foundational coding architecture I had meticulously taught myself during my 15-minute breaks. I looked up from the box, my mind struggling to process the presence of these artifacts. "I thought Dad threw all of this away when I moved out," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He told me it was junk cluttering up the garage. He did throw it away, Melissa confessed, her eyes fixed on the cracked laptop screen. He tossed the entire box into the trash bin behind the house the week after you left for your first apartment. He told Mom it was a pathetic reminder of your refusal to meet his standards. She paused, swallowing hard, her gaze finally lifting to meet mine. I waited until he went to sleep that night, and I pulled it out of the trash. I hid it in the back of my closet, and I kept it safely hidden through every move, every apartment, and every academic milestone. I stared at her, genuinely astounded. Why, I asked the question hanging heavily in the quiet room. Why would you save the things he mocked? You spent your entire life agreeing with him that my work was worthless. Melissa shook her head slowly, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. I never thought your work was worthless, Nadia. I saved this box because it was the only thing in that massive empty house that represented actual, undeniable brilliance. She leaned forward, the raw, unvarnished truth finally spilling out of her. I watched you build algorithms from scratch while sitting on a cold concrete floor. I saw the raw intellect you possessed, and it terrified me because I knew I could never replicate it. Dad spent his entire life telling me I was a genius, but every time I looked at the code you wrote in those notebooks, I knew I was an imposter. The confession was brutal in its honesty. She was admitting that the arrogant superiority she had projected for 30 years was nothing more than a fragile shield designed to protect a terrified, inadequate imposter. I kept the box because it reminded me of the truth. Melissa continued, her voice trembling slightly. Even when I stole your algorithm for my thesis, I knew it was the only way I could survive the academic pressure. I needed a piece of your actual genius to sustain the fake pedestal Dad built for me. I treasured these things because I always knew what they meant. They meant you were the smart one. I looked down at the cracked laptop, tracing my finger over the scratched silver casing. The profound, aching splinter of our childhood, the memory of the 12-year-old girl who shielded me from a shattered vase, suddenly resurfaced with piercing clarity. The revelation reframed the entire architecture of our animosity. She had not hated me out of genuine malice. She had resented me out of sheer, overwhelming envy. I remember when you took the blame for the crystal vase, I said softly, the words breaking the heavy silence. You stepped right in front of him. You protected me. Melissa closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. We were allies back then, she whispered, before he realized that keeping us united was dangerous for him. She opened her eyes, looking at me with a profound, sudden clarity. The ultimate realization that finally laid the 30-year wound to rest hung in the air between us. He was never comparing us. Nadia Melissa stated, her voice resonating with a quiet, undeniable certainty. He was just afraid we'd figure out neither of us needed him. If we had stayed allies, if I had admitted you were the brilliant one, and you had helped me navigate the pressure, we would have recognized how small and pathetic his control actually was. He pitted us against each other to ensure we remained dependent on his validation. He broke us in opposite directions so we could never find strength in each other. This sentence struck me like a physical revelation. The crushing, suffocating lie that my worth was contingent on defeating my sister instantly evaporated. The comparison was never a legitimate metric of our intelligence. It was a manufactured engine of control designed by a deeply insecure man. The toxic narrative that had driven my relentless, exhausting climb to the top of the corporate ladder was finally completely dead. I looked across the mahogany desk at my older sister. I did not feel a sudden, cinematic surge of instantaneous forgiveness. The betrayal of the stolen algorithm and the years of cruel condescension could not be erased with a single honest conversation. Trust is a fragile, complex structure that requires time and consistent action to rebuild if it can ever be rebuilt at all. We were not magically restored to the innocent allies we had been in the foyer of our childhood home. But as I sat there looking at the exhausted woman who had just handed me back the physical evidence of my own resilience, I realized I no longer needed her to fail. I did not require her public humiliation to feel secure in my own achievements, and I certainly did not need her validation to make me whole. The desperate burning need for retribution was entirely gone. "Thank you for keeping the box," I said, simply pulling the cardboard container closer to my side of the desk. Melissa nodded a faint, genuine expression of relief, softening her tired features. She did not ask for a hug. She did not press for a promise of future dinners or sisterly outings. She understood the boundaries that the past 14 months had permanently established. She stood up from the leather chair, adjusting her simple gray sweater, and offered a quiet, respectful goodbye. I did not walk her to the elevator. I remained seated at my desk, watching her walk out of the office. The heavy glass doors closed behind her, leaving me alone in the expansive suite. The late afternoon sun sank lower over the Boston harbor, casting a warm, golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The light spilled across the polished walnut desk, illuminating the cracked silver laptop and the faded blue name badge. I sat in the quiet, empty room, not celebrating a vicious, destructive victory, but simply existing in a state of profound, unbothered calm. It was a quiet, ambiguous, adult peace. It lacked the fiery, explosive drama of a courtroom confrontation, but as I watched the golden harbor light reflect off the broken screen of my first computer, it felt infinitely truer than any triumph I had ever imagined. 1 year later, the hum of the servers down the hall provided a steady, rhythmic heartbeat to the empty office. The cleaning staff had left hours ago, leaving me alone in the expansive suite overlooking the Boston harbor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the dark water reflected the scattered lights of the city shoreline, while a soft autumn rain traced silent paths down the window panes. I sat behind my polished walnut desk, the only illumination coming from the warm circle of a brass reading lamp and the glow of my dual monitors. Resting in the center of the desk was a thick bound document bearing the embossed seal of the United States Department of Defense. It was a finalized logistics security contract. The ink on the signature line was barely dry. I ran my fingertips over the textured paper, feeling the physical weight of a year spent in relentless pursuit of stability. My data architecture firm had grown steadily over the past 12 months. I did not experience a sudden miraculous windfall or a cinematic overnight explosion of wealth. The growth was meticulous and hard-earned. Securing this federal contract required navigating a grueling labyrinth of compliance reviews, penetration testing, and rigorous background checks. The government auditors scrutinized every line of code my team produced, searching for vulnerabilities. We won the bid not because the universe decided to reward me for surviving my family, but because my software architecture held up under the harshest scrutiny imaginable. I had simply survived the storm long enough to be found by the people who needed my skills. The silence in the office was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise that used to define my existence. Thomas was currently serving the second year of his sentence in a federal correctional facility. The Boston Brahmin circles he once commanded had forgotten his name, moving on to the next passing scandal. Melissa had relocated to a quiet town in the Midwest, working an entry-level administrative job far away from the crushing expectations of academia. She was rebuilding her life slowly and honestly. I had not spoken to my father since the day the federal agents arrived. The quiet distance between us was the foundational bedrock of my new reality. I reached for my mug, taking a slow sip of cooling black coffee. As I set the ceramic cup down, a small notification pinged in the lower right corner of my primary monitor. An email had just arrived in my secure inbox. The sender was Maya, a 19-year-old junior engineer I had brought onto the team 6 months ago. Maya worked the evening shift at a local pharmacy to help her mother cover their rent. She showed up to her part-time hours at my consultancy, smelling of fluorescent lighting and deep fatigue, always carrying a battered second-hand laptop covered in peeling stickers. During her interview, I had asked her to write a simple sorting script. She did not use standard academic formatting. She used a highly efficient, unorthodox syntax that I recognized instantly. It was the raw, unrefined code of someone who had taught herself how to build software in the dark. I opened the email. A single compressed zip file was attached. The text in the body of the message was brief, lacking the polished corporate jargon of my senior developers. It read, "Here is the predictive sorting module you asked for." It took a few tries to get the logic loops right. This is the first thing I have built that I am actually proud of. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen, feeling a profound resonance settle deep within my chest. I remembered the freezing temperatures of a retail stockroom. I remembered balancing a cracked laptop on my knees, hiding from a demanding manager, while typing lines of code into a machine held together by duct tape. I remembered the desperate silent hope that my labor would eventually matter to someone. I downloaded the attached file, dragging it onto my desktop. I did not open my code editor to review the syntax. Instead, I opened the primary security dashboard of my network and selected the provenance watermarking application. For my entire professional life, I had viewed this specific software as an armor plating. It was the perimeter defense I engineered to protect myself from predators who wanted to steal my labor. I had weaponized the tool in a Cambridge boardroom to catch a thief, dismantle a conspiracy, and secure my own survival. The software was born out of a desperate need to guard my territory. But tonight, sitting in the quiet calm of my office, the function of the code shifted. I dragged Maya's file into the verification window. The system hummed, analyzing the embedded digital metadata. The screen fractured into lines of chronological tracking data, stripping away the superficial layers of the file to reveal the bedrock underneath. The cryptographic hashes aligned, sorting through the invisible digital ledger. A plain, unadorned line of text appeared on the monitor. It displayed Maya's full legal name, her secure biometric login token, and the exact timestamp of creation recorded at 2 a.m. I did not look at the screen searching for fraud or deception. I looked at the data to certify her ownership. I placed my hands on the keyboard and typed a reply to the young engineer. "The code is clean," I wrote. "The architecture is sound. I ran the provenance check. This is your work, Maya. It belongs to you, and it is exceptional. We will implement it in the beta testing phase next week." I hit the send button. Sending that brief message shifted a heavy permanent weight off my shoulders. The deepest wound I carried was never the theft of my intellectual property or the fraudulent bank loans. The true enduring injury was the crushing invisible burden of never being seen. For 30 years I had waited for my father to look at my work and acknowledge my existence. The triumph of my current life was not the sleek corner office, the panoramic view of the harbor, or the lucrative federal contracts resting on my desk. The quiet triumph was becoming the person who possesses the power to see others. I had the authority and the tools to validate the unseen labor of the people grinding in the shadows. I became the validator I never had. I closed the laptop lid. The dual monitors went dark, leaving only the warm pool of light from the brass reading lamp. My gaze drifted to the edge of the polished walnut desk. Resting near my pen cup, housed in a simple silver frame, was a photograph. I had tracked down the digital file of the image a few months ago and printed it myself. It was the exact same photograph that once lived on my father's phone lock screen. In the foreground, Thomas and Melissa stood in sharp, vibrant focus, smiling brightly and celebrating a fabricated academic milestone. The camera lens had captured their pristine, wealthy illusion with perfect clarity. But I did not look at them. My eyes bypassed the smiling figures in the front and traced the blurred shape standing in the deep background. I looked at the teenager wearing the scratchy blue polyester vest, holding a plastic retail scanner, exhausted and dismissed by the people standing mere feet away. I looked at the girl in the photograph without flinching. The blue vest was no longer a symbol of mockery. It was not a badge of inferiority or a source of enduring shame. It was the undeniable starting line of a formidable ascent. The silence in the office was profound and steady. The harbor water glimmered through the glass, reflecting a quiet, enduring light. The girl in the vest was never the lesser one. She was just the one nobody bothered to check. The rain sweeping across the Boston harbor continued its steady rhythm against the glass of my corner office, but the lifelong storm inside my chest had finally broken. The journey from a freezing retail stockroom to the helm of a highly respected data security firm taught me that securing a future requires far more than just compiling flawless code. It requires the courage to dismantle the deeply ingrained illusions that hold you captive. Looking back at the shattered remnants of my father's pristine facade and the revocation of my sister's fabricated academic crown, I recognize the brutal truths that ultimately secured my freedom. First, I learned that shared DNA is never a binding contract for perpetual suffering. Society conditions us to believe we owe our families an endless supply of forgiveness. However, when relatives utilize your empathy as a shield to conceal their own profound incompetence, severing that biological tie becomes a necessary act of self-preservation. Loyalty must be earned through mutual respect, not extracted through unyielding manipulation. Second, I discovered that ignoring a parasite does not starve it. For 2 years, I stayed quiet about the theft of my proprietary algorithm, disguising my fear of confrontation as stoic patience. I realized too late that unaddressed violations do not simply vanish into the background. They fester, multiply, and grow until they threaten to consume your entire livelihood. Confronting the rot at its origin is the only way to safeguard your foundation. Third, true validation can never be harvested from individuals who are inherently committed to misunderstanding you. I spent 3 decades waiting for an arrogant patriarch to look past his chosen golden child and acknowledge my intellect. The very moment I stopped seeking his approval, I stripped him of all his leverage over my psychology. Your inherent worth is self-evident. It does not require a toxic audience to make it real. Fourth, genuine justice operates with precise proportionality, not unchecked cruelty. When I held the leverage to eradicate my mother and permanently destroy my sister, I chose measured restraint. Retribution that fits the crime like a specific key sliding into a lock is infinitely more satisfying than inflicting indiscriminate pain. Exercising selective mercy on my own terms proved I was nothing like the fragile, demanding man who raised us. Finally, the very elements your detractors mock will become the exact armor you wear to your ultimate victory. The frayed blue retail vest and the cracked secondhand laptop were never symbols of my inferiority. They constituted the crucible that forged my unyielding resilience. The darkest, most exhausting chapters of your journey are simply the required training ground for the empire you are destined to architect. I turned off the brass reading lamp on my walnut desk, plunging the executive suite into comfortable shadows, illuminated only by the sprawling city skyline. I picked up my leather coat, leaving the framed photograph resting exactly where it belonged. I am no longer a ghost haunting the blurred background of a fake family portrait. I am the sole architect of my own unassailable reality. If you have ever had to break a generational cycle of manipulation, or if you used your own quiet brilliance to outsmart those who tried to keep you confined to the dark, tell me your story in the comments below. What is the hardest boundary you have ever had to enforce? Hit that like button and subscribe to Rabbit Revenge for more narratives of survival, calculated justice, and reclaiming your rightful power. Never apologize for protecting your peace, and never let anyone convince you that your brilliance belongs in their shadow.